Okay, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good evening to those in the DC. My name is Yoon-hee Kim, Senior Project Manager of National Democratic Institute, Seoul. Welcome you all here. First of all, I'd like to thank you for joining us 2022 International Dialogue on North Korea Human Rights, hosted by the Ministry of Unification and sponsored by the UN OHCHR Seoul. This event is the first MOU-hosted international dialogue after the Yoon government has begun to discuss North Korea human rights issues with the international community. Through today's dialogue, we will reflect on what we've done for the last 20 years and what we can do more, what would be and should be the role of the international community to improve North Korea human rights going forward. So for that, we have many of distinguished guests here today. Let me give you a brief introduction of our distinguished guest. First of all, we have the Honorable Kwon Yongse, Minister of Unification. We have the Honorable Ban Ki-moon, former UN Secretary General. And we have the Honorable Lee Shin-wha, Ambassador for International Cooperation on North Korea Human Rights, as well as a professor of Korea University. We also have a group of great panelists in person and virtually. So let me first introduce to you who are with us in this place now. We have the Honorable Lee Hoon, former and first ambassador for international cooperation on North Korea human rights and professor of Yonsei University. And Mr. Greg Scarlett, Executive Director of Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. And we have Mr. Kim Bum-soo, Executive Director of Safe North Korea. We have Madame Yoana Hosanyak, Deputy Director General of Citizens Alliance for North Korea Human Rights. And now time to introduce our virtual panelists. We have the Honorable Robert King, former Special Envoy for North Korea Human Rights of the United States. And Professor Gi-Wook from Stanford University. And Dr. Victor Cha, Korea Chair at CSIS and Vice Dean of Georgetown University. And Dr. Andrew Young, Korea Chair at Brookings Institution and Professor of Catholic University of the United States. Again, thank you very much for joining with us late at night in DC. And now let us move on to opening remarks. The Honorable Mr. Kwon Yongse will give us a few good words to open today's event. Your Excellencies, please come on to the stage. Please give them a big round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Minister Yongse Kwon of Unification. I'd like to welcome all the participants for your presence at 2022 International Dialogue on North Korean Human Rights, hosted by Ministry of Unification of the Republic of Korea. Today's event is the very first international seminar on North Korean human rights hosted by our ministry since the official launch of the Yoon administration. I'd like to thank Ambassador Shin-wha Lee of International Cooperation on North Korean Human Rights for your efforts in making this event possible. Former Secretary General Kim Pan for your upcoming welcoming remarks. And my special thanks go to former U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean Human Rights, Robert King, and President Mi Kim of Ewha Women's University for your presence today. And I'd like to extend my gratitude to all the experts who are going to share their insights and participants with a high level of interest in North Korean human rights. Dear participants, human rights situations in the two Koreas are showing quite clear contrasts. Ever since the division in 1945, the South has been able to achieve economic prosperity and the development of liberal democracy, thus becoming a prosperous nation where citizens can fully enjoy their human rights. In contrast, the North has chosen dictatorship and decided to close its doors. As we speak, North Korean people are not able to enjoy their basic rights and freedom. In that regard, I believe normalizing such abnormal imbalance is the most urgent mission we have. Of course, North Korean human rights issues are the ones that require international solidarity and humanitarian approaches, but it is also an issue of Korean people as the same ethnic group sharing the language, history, as well as culture. We should not neglect North Korean people who have been denied decent lives just because they were living in the North when the decision of division was made. Improving human rights situations in the North is our responsibility as well as duty as a companion for the future unification for a complete integration of the Korean Peninsula and unified Korea. Meanwhile, we can still feel how saddened separated families and family members of abductees in the North, prisoners of wars, as well as detained South Koreans are. On top of that, 30,000 North Korean refugees escaped from the North for freedom and life with dignity and finally settled down in the South. To them, North Korean human rights issues are the matter of very survival. In that regard, improving the North Korean human rights situations is the way to provide the North Korean people with basic human rights as well as to relieve the pain of division. The Yoon administration will remain committed to the unified Korea, where North and South Korean people can enjoy happy and decent lives based on the universal value of freedom, democracy, and human rights. We will call on the North Korean authorities to be aligned with international human rights norms so as to improve human rights situations in the North while strengthening solidarity with the international community. At the same time, we will make sure that our North Korean human rights policies can lay the practical foundation for the integration of our society, further growth of inter-Korean relations, and the preparation for unified Korea. So far, the international community has been very much committed to improving the human rights situations in the North by adopting UNG resolutions on the situation of human rights in the North, which has failed to lead changes in the North's oppressive system. Throughout this seminar, I hope we will be able to talk about pending issues regarding human rights and find ways for cooperation between government, international community, and civil society. We will make sure to reflect your voices into our policies. Once again, I'd like to thank all the participants for joining us today. I wish all of you good health and happiness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the great opening remarks. And next, I'm so honored to invite the Honorable Ban Ki-moon, the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, to come on the stage for congratulatory remarks. Please give him a big round of applause.
Honorable Kwon Yongse, Minister of Unification of Korea, Professor Shin-wha, Ambassador, International Cooperation on North Korean Human Rights, eminent panelists, participants, experts, excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great privilege to speak to you here at the 2022 International Dialogue on North Korean Human Rights. I take this opportunity to offer my highest congratulations on the organization of today's important dialogue. My deep appreciation goes to Professor Shin-wha for her inspiring passion and guiding vision in taking tangible steps to address these critical but delicate issues. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are living in an unprecedented era of international crisis and heightened global insecurity and uncertainty. All these issues are tightly interconnected. Therefore, we need to have all issues resolved in a much more organized way. Geopolitical tension is accelerating particularly between the United States and China. Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine is causing humanitarian disaster as well as global insecurity in energy, food, supply chain. All these are accelerating global divisions and hindering cooperation among countries. At the same time, still ongoing COVID-19 pandemic continues to disrupt our economies, societies, and way of our lives. Our one and only planet is on fire as climate crisis is deepening with rising sea levels, surging temperatures, raging floods, and burning wildfires. Turning to the Korean Peninsula, tensions are growing as a result of continuing escalating provocations from North Korea that have been once again elucidated the tragedy of the ongoing human rights situation in North Korea. As you know very well, human rights, alongside peace and security, as well as development, constitute one of the three pillars of the United Nations Charter and stands at the very core of the universal values that steer the United Nations in its work. Without human rights, it's simply impossible to ensure peace and security or achieve a sustainable development. Sustainable development, peace without human rights is just meaningless. However rich, resourceful, however you may have everything, when your human rights are not protected and respected, as a human being, it's just meaningless. Human rights, which were earned through blood of our forefathers and institutionalized through important key documents and norms, such as Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are now under obvious threat globally as nationalism, xenophobia spread, leaders persecute and control their citizens, and bloody wars and conflicts continue to proliferate. UN member states are obligated to protect the human rights of their citizens. Indeed, it is their fundamental duty, based on both the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, many countries are egregiously violating human rights of their own citizens through various abuses, mechanisms, forms, and measures. And situation in North Korea is particularly dire. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, indeed, the landmark report of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 2014 vividly highlighted, I quote, systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations, unquote, taking place in the country. The report also detailed that, I quote again, in many instances, the violations found entailed crimes against humanity based on state policies, unquote. From 2014 and to 2018, the UN Security Council held important public debates featuring briefings by the High Commissioner for Human Rights on this tragic issue. Sadly, the Security Council has not held an open debate on the human rights situation in North Korea since 2018. And during the last 4 years, the human rights situation in North Korea has continued to deteriorate, with the UN Special Rapporteur reporting that, I quote, serious concerns that segments of the population, especially vulnerable populations, may be facing hunger and starvation, unquote, alongside brutal ongoing COVID-19 restrictions. In this connection, I take this opportunity to commend the reprioritization of this issue by President Yoon Suk-yeol's administration of the Republic of Korea. I also call on the UN Security Council to once again hold open, formal debates on North Korean human rights. It is shameful that this issue has been minimized by the Security Council, even though the COI, Committee of Inquiry, explicitly urged the Security Council to refer the human rights situation in North Korea to the ICC, International Criminal Court, and adopt sanctions against those most responsible for crimes against humanity. I firmly believe that today's dialogue on North Korean human rights is especially important ahead of the 10-year anniversary of the COI's mandate in March 2023. As several dozens of North Korean missiles and other brazen military provocations frequently rain down on the peninsula and beyond, it is critical that the international community does not forget the long-suffering people in North Korea and the deplorable ongoing rights abuses that they are subject to even at this moment. And it is crucial to remember that these two issues are inherently interconnected, as the North Korean leadership has poured unfathomable state resources into the development of SWMD, weapons of mass destruction programs, at the expense of its food insecure population and their basic human rights, including tens of millions of US dollars on missile launches in a single day alone on November 2nd of this year. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, while serving as Secretary General of the United Nations, I have emphasized on a number of occasions the importance of focusing on North Korean issues such as human rights and denuclearization. I also pursued opportunities to visit the country on 3 different occasions, which have been confirmed invitation, but sudden cancellation by North Korean authorities without prior explanation disappointingly blocked my hopes of visiting Pyongyang. Those cancellations, as I presume, seems to be based on my strong remarks on North Korean issues. It was 2015 when I was visiting Korea, and we made the very important speeches with then President Park Geun-hye at UNESCO-initiated conference in Songdo. There I announced that I would visit North Korea, Pyongyang. Then there was a press conference, and I was asked whether I would raise these human rights issues when I go to North Korea. I said, of course. That has provoked and irritated North Koreans. The next morning, they canceled my invitation. Then I had to explain why it has been explained following day. That was quite disappointing. And again, for me personally, humiliating that it has been canceled just one day before my visit. These are something which I am still feel very much regrettable. As a result of my personal and professional focus on North Korean issues, and despite the challenges I faced at that time, I have never stopped believing that it will be eventually possible to achieve the improvement of human rights situation alongside denuclearization and sustainable peace in North Korea. But we cannot and should not remain static or disengaged. Instead, we must elevate our collective advocacy for North Korean human rights. Before concluding my remarks, I reiterate my warm congratulations on the opening of the dialogue, and I have a full confidence and strong belief that Ambassador Lee Shin-wha will carry on her mission as ambassador in charge of North Korean nuclear issue and make North Korean people sustainable and happy with due respect for their human rights. That's the basic principles of the United Nations Charter. And in that regard, I sincerely hope that your active participation in discussions will yield great results today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such insightful and inspiring remarks. Before we begin our first session, we're going to have a photo time. So to set the stage, we need a few 4 minutes. Okay, now let's begin our first session. And Ambassador Lee will chair first as well as second sessions both. And let us at a bit of introduction of Ambassador Lee. She has written multiple books and articles on North Korea and international relations. She was a former UN Secretary General's Advisor Group member of the Peacebuilding Fund, and also a former special advisor to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan on the independent inquiry on the Rwanda genocide. She is currently a president of Korea Academic Council on the United Nations system, and as if it's not enough, she was appointed ambassador for international cooperation on North Korea human rights in last July. Your Excellency, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. This is Shin-wha Lee. I'm going to just chair the 2 sessions of today's international hybrid conferences. And I truly appreciate all your participation, particularly our panelists, my predecessor, Ambassador Hoon, and then those who are participating from the US and other places online. And welcome and thank you so much. Well, after being appointed as the ambassador last July, it's been quite busy and challenging and yet fruitful 4+ months. The Yoon government, which was launched in May, pursues freedom and human rights as a core value in national policy. And also the government is promoting the improvement of human rights in North Korea as a top priority together with the denuclearization in North Korean policy. Over the last 20 years, the international community has made a sincere effort to improve the human rights in North Korea. UN appointed a special rapporteur since 2004 and formed the UN Commission of Inquiry in 2013. After the release of the COI report in February 2014, many efforts have been made, including establishment of the UN Human Rights Seoul Office in 2015. In 2004, in the US and in 2016 in Republic of Korea, the North Korean Human Rights Act was enacted through an agreement between the ruling and the opposition political parties, and various efforts have been made since then in order to enhance North Korean human rights issues at the both governmental and private levels. However, it is my concern, frustration, and anger to note that human rights situation in North Korean people has even further deteriorated, particularly in the wake of COVID-19. And North Korean authorities are still focusing on developing nuclear weapons and missiles rather than policy to promote its people's livelihood and human rights. I believe that when it comes to North Korean human rights issues, there are at least 4 elements we have to consider. The first is the North Korean people within North Korea who needs a right to food and right to information. Number 2 is overseas defector problems, particularly those who are reside in China in fear of being forcibly repatriated. And then third is the prisoner of war and post-war abductees and detainees as well as those separate family members who are aging now. The fourth is how to deal with North Korean regime, who is the very perpetrator of human rights the abuses in North Korea. For that, I do believe we should give a priority to the accountability, but at the same time, we have to deal with North Korean regime. For that, I think a constructive engagement is also important. The North Korean issue is a matter of universal human rights value and is a matter of fundamental basic right of human beings that cannot be swayed by the nature and inclination of the political leadership, nor the domestic and international circumstances. However, I'm afraid to say it's been facing at least the four serious dilemmas. I'll be brief. First, unfortunately, not only domestically, but also in the international community, the term North Korean human rights is highly politicized and regretfully has become a subject of controversy and also antagonism, mainly because of the divisive and polarized political dynamics of the superpower, the politics, great power politics. And also within Korea, it is one of the difficult topics to dealing with it and also make a consensus because of those the very big the controversies among conservative and liberal political parties. Second, over the past few years, South Korea and the US have sidelined North Korean human rights issue in their policy priorities and even excluded it from the negotiation agenda in order to improve or negotiate denuclearization issue and also improve the inter-Korean relations. But we didn't go anywhere for that. And third, North Korean human rights has given urgency and priority to crises that are the headline of the international community, such as the Ukraine crisis. The fourth, the issue has fallen into the so-called fatigue phenomena of the international community as a result of being an issue that has been lingering for decades without any progress. Furthermore, the North Korean authorities regard human rights issue as part of the hostile policy of the international community, including South Korean government, and do not respond or reject the issues raised by the international community or often pours out very nasty curses. To find a solution to these problems, I aim for two clear, principled, and decisive approaches. Number one, human rights violation in North Korea and military provocation by the North Korean regime are two sides of the same coin, so we must closely connect North Korean human rights with security of the Korean Peninsula to seek solution. Number two, in order to prevent the ghettoization of North Korean human rights issues, international cooperation is urgently and widely required within the framework of universal human rights principles and other human rights issues around the world. Against this background, this conference was prepared to look at various issues, challenges, and tasks related to North Korean human rights issues. And I would like to look at the efforts and tasks that international community must and will take to broaden domestic and international consensus on what North Korean human rights is. So finally, for that, as I, during my tenure, intend to hold the various scholarly, policy, and civil society meetings and intense discussion on how to revitalize and effectively approach these issues. So this conference is the first step in many small, large, online and offline and hybrid the meetings and conference of this kind to come. So it is my great pleasure and honor to be able to review the definition and issues and challenges of human rights in North Korea, together with the scholars, experts, and policymakers who have the best knowledge, expertise, passion, and dedication in this field. So having said that, I will open this first session by giving our 5 distinguished panelists who are joining from online, 3 of them, and then the Ambassador Lee, and who are in present with us. So let me begin with Ambassador Robert King. Hello, Bob. So may I just ask you your experience and like a kind of insightful analysis of what you think about the North Korean human rights challenges based on your almost 7-year experience as a U.S. Special Envoy?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and participate in this conference with all of the distinguished participants that are here. I'm particularly pleased that both you, Ambassador Lee Shin-wha, and Ambassador Lee Jung-hoon, who was your predecessor, are both participating in the conference. I want to begin by expressing my regret that the United States does not currently have a special envoy for North Korean human rights to be here and participate in this conference. It's now been almost 6 years since I left that position, and that position has not been filled since then. Unfortunately, it looks like it will be another several months before there will be a possibility of having a United States Special Envoy for North Korea human rights in place because the Congress is going through the end of the session and the beginning of the new session, and it will require Senate confirmation for the appointment of a new Special Envoy. So this is something that's not going to happen for another several months. Unfortunately, we are now 6 years without the United States having a functioning special envoy to deal with North Korea human rights issues. It's important to have an ambassador in this position because of the ability that it has to call attention to the problems that we face. And so I have urged publicly and privately that this is a step that needs to be taken. Unfortunately, it has not. The irony is that the United States is heavily politicized right now. But on the question of North Korea human rights and on the question of designating a special envoy, both political parties are in very much agreement. The last several times the North Korean Human Rights Act has been extended and reauthorized, it has been approved by unanimous votes in the House and in the Senate. So there's no political reason why it hasn't gone forward. It's other things that keep getting in the way that shouldn't. So I look forward to having somebody in place, hopefully soon, to be able to assist in what is happening here. One of the things that I'd like to focus on is we need to be careful about not getting too impatient with progress on North Korea human rights. In an era when we instantaneously are able to turn on and look at a screen and see what's happening around the world, we expect things to happen quickly. And unfortunately, when we're dealing with the North Korea human rights issues, we're expecting things are going to happen fast. It's not going to happen that way. One of the things that we have talked about is the problems in the United Nations moving forward and being able to put pressure on North Korea to make progress. We've been doing that now for approaching 2 decades. The first special rapporteur was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2004, 2005, and we're now with Ambassador Lee on the fourth special rapporteur. So it's important that we not get impatient because it has not happened as quickly as we'd like to have. We have made progress. North Korea continues to be an issue in the United Nations. It is raised and discussed publicly in the Human Rights Council annually. It's raised and discussed Third Committee of the General Assembly. It has been discussed in the Security Council, not as publicly and as openly as we would like in the last few years, but nonetheless, it has been on the agenda and it's increasingly getting attention and focus. Because we're doing this does not mean we're going to have immediate solutions and immediate action. We need to continue to press North Korea, and North Korea needs to feel the pressure of the international community for what it isn't doing in terms of moving forward on human rights. We need to keep up the struggle, even though it's not moving as fast as we'd like to see it. One of the things that I am particularly concerned about as we look at the human rights situation is the problem of declining access to information. North Korea has always been a difficult country for getting information into and getting information out of. It's become increasingly difficult in the last couple of years because of technological improvements that have been made that make it more difficult for us to get information into North Korea. It's also been more difficult to get information and individuals out of North Korea because of the COVID pandemic and the tightened restrictions on movement in and around the borders of North Korea. But my sense is we need to focus on what can we do in terms of making progress on getting more information into North Korea. It's more difficult to smuggle in thumb drives. It's more difficult for people to listen to radio broadcasts. We need to continue that effort. We need to look at ways that we can make progress and move forward and get more information into North Korea. Greater information is an important element that will lead to change, and I think it's important that we focus on that. The problem of the COVID pandemic is one of the great difficulties that's restricting what goes on these days. Because of COVID, the North Korean government has had both the incentive and the ability to restrict travel in and out of North Korea, more limitations on individuals, foreigners visiting North Korea. This has created problems and difficulties, and we need to have make an effort to get around the obstacles and the problems that this has created. The one thing that I think is most important to keep in mind is that as we have sought to make progress on human rights, it has not moved as quickly as we've wanted it to, but we cannot give up. We can't back away. We can't say, well, it's not worth the effort to do what needs to be done in the United Nations to press North Korea. The important thing is that we continue the struggle, even if it means we're going to have to continue to do that for some time. I hope we can continue. I hope we can persist, because that is the only way we're going to be able to make progress in terms of improving human rights in North Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador King. Well, thank you for highlighting the importance of the appointment of U.S. Special Envoy. Hopefully, it's coming soon, as well as you emphasizing the importance of the right to information. And despite all the difficulties and frustration, we shouldn't give up our effort and do so. So, just briefly, I would like to give our thanks to the participation of ambassadors of European unions, and then the Spain's, and as well as the Mongolia. Thank you so much. Next, the panelist will be the Professor Gi-Wook from Stanford. Actually, he was the very person who were behind the scenes to encourage me to organizing this kind of the conference, as well as the continuous support my work. So I would like to say that thank you for this opportunity, Professor Shin, and that you have a floor and talk about for 7 minutes or so on your view on what we should do for North Korean human rights issue.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Lee, and congratulations for organizing excellent conference on a very important and timely issue. Actually, I prepared PowerPoint. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and I'm sure there are a lot of overlap in our talk. So I'll try to share my thoughts and maybe offer some ideas or suggestions. So please bear with me. Okay, so a few years ago, I was working with Bob King to organize a conference. And actually, as you can see on the screen, we published a book called The North Korean Conundrum and How to Balance Between Human Rights and Nuclear Security. And actually, Victor and Kim Min-jung from Save North Korea and other people made a contribution to this book. And as you know, there's a tendency to ignore human rights out of fear that raising the issue will undermine denuclearization efforts or inter-Korean relations. People are concerned about North Korean reaction, and also this danger of weaponizing human rights issue for political interest, like demonizing North Korea, which was happened early days of the Trump administration. But still, this has not worked so far. Not much progress on any of those issues by ignoring or overlooking human rights issue. So, for example, under Moon Jae-in government, they ignored human rights issue. Once again, concerned with North Korean reaction, but then it didn't really lead to much progress on inter-Korea relations. And Trump summit diplomacy that also ignored human rights did not lead to progress on nuclear issues. Rather, a few months ago, Kim Jong-un publicly vowed to never give up nuclear weapons. So as some people already mentioned, in principle and reality, human rights should be a key element of a comprehensive North Korean policy. And of course, it's a policy question. If you're gonna pursue simultaneously or sequencing, still, human rights should be a key element of this policy. And having grown up in South Korea, I like to remind Korean people that actually during authoritarian years of South Korea, the United States, the government and civic organization, they paid attention to human rights issue along with security matters, like in 1970s. I mean, we know about like human rights diplomacy by Jimmy Carter and so on. So it's not like it's only about North Korea. Actually, a lot of South Korean people fighting for democracy, they really appreciated that U.S. or international community raising human rights violation within the South. So I think engaging North Korea on human rights issue without politicizing or demonizing could also build confidence in establishing relationship to resolve security and peace issues. Of course, it's very challenging, but still, human rights progress might be prerequisite for improving security issues. So a country that is willing to oppress its own people will feel even less constrained about using forces against other nations. So I'm going to briefly talk about four main area or maybe key stake holders in this issue. One is domestic issue around North Korean human rights within South Korea. So there has to be political consensus and increased public awareness of this issue. So this has to be a non-partisan issue, and I think South Korea should really launch the North Korea Human Rights Foundation as soon as possible. And also paying more attention to human rights of North Korean defectors in the South and working with them without politicizing human rights issues. And I think once again, here I'd like to remind the South Korean public of US and international community's role in addressing South Korean human rights issues during authoritarian years. Actually, there was North American Coalition for Human Rights and Democracy in South Korea. This was NGO in the United States. It was helping Korean democratic movement from, I think, from mid-1970s until early 90s. And actually, I don't know why, but they contacted me as they were closing the operation. Still, I was teaching at UCLA. And then they sent about 35 boxes of a lot of documents. And I went through every box. It's really moving how much US NGO was supporting Korean democratic movement. So there's an archive at UCLA. So if you're interested in their activity, you can easily access to their documents. So ironically, those South Korean activists who really appreciated American support for their movement, they ignored North Korean human rights once they are in power. And of course, a lot of United States, and I think Bob King already mentioned on those issues, so I'm going to skip. But I think for Ambassador Lee and maybe your people may work with U.S. NGO academics and experts. Of course, this is one excellent example. But also, I'd like to point out that in many U.S. colleges and universities, including our campus, they usually hold an annual North Korean human rights night. So probably it may be useful to have some joint events with Korean colleges and universities. So that's one idea that I'd like to suggest. And the next one, regional geopolitics. I mean, here, China plays a role in the abuse of North Koreans. We tended to focus on China's abuse in Xinjiang, Tibet, but forget about abuse of North Korean refugees in China. And I think this issue may get attention from Washington, actually. So I'm sure, Victor may say more, but there's no appetite for North Korean issue in Washington, D.C. these days. I'm saying it's more than strategic patience. It's more like a strategic neglect. So this might be worth exploring to get more attention from U.S. and international community, and also working with Japan. And then finally, working with UN, already Mr. Ban Ki-moon and Bob Kim mentioned about UN role. And despite all those provocation and abuse, I believe that North Korea wants to be accepted in the community of nations. And then they should know, and I think they know that they have to improve human rights record to be accepted. And in the beginning, I mentioned that usually North Korea reacting in very, of course, very negative way, but still, sometimes they responded to international community when they are raising human rights issue. I think one example was COI mentioned earlier. So therefore, I think there's urgency of addressing those Korean human rights issues right now, and I'm sure that's a mission of Ambassador Lee and her office. And once again, we should approach the issue as one of universal values, not of demonizing or politicizing North Korea. And then this should be consistent with Mr. Yoon's value democracy or liberal democracy, so that we frame those Korean human rights issue within the larger foreign policy approach. So I think maybe elaborating, articulating with a larger policy framework will be very important. And then once again, engage or work very closely with the key stakeholders. So I think given time limits, I'm going to stop here. And I'm happy to engage more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shin. I'm just grateful you mentioned about importance of political consensus as well as the public awareness both within Korea and US and beyond. And also you talk about the importance of the Chinese role as well as our cooperation with Japan. And I would like to note that the last November, though belatedly, the US and Japan and Korea trilateral summit meeting was highlighting the issue of abductees and detainees. And also you mentioned about the role of the UN. I think we have to push for how we can make UN Security Council's open meeting on North Korean human rights issue. For that, we need one or two more support from non-permanent member states. So for that, I would like to ask you the question a bit later. Our third panelist will be the Ambassador Jung. Well, although I'm struggling as well, I'm largely supported by Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Unification and other government. But as your first ambassador, you've been working very hard. And then thank you for putting some stepping stone on which I can work with. So that I would like to give you a floor to briefly talk about what you think we should do for North Korean human rights issues based on your struggle and work as a former ambassador.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Shin-wha. It's really a great honor, but I'm more excited to be here because for the past 2 years, we've not had this sort of opportunity to physically meet. So it's fantastic to finally get together with Greg and Bob and Victor, Professor Shin, all together. So I commend Ambassador Shin-wha for putting together such a wonderful gathering. She's had, within the short time span that she's been the ambassador, she has really pushed forth and put in a gargantuan effort to make a difference on this issue and make this an issue again, because for the past 5 years or so, it has not been so. Now, I'd like to, within the given time, talk about what's gone wrong in the past few years to make the North Korean human rights issue kind of stumble, take a back seat. And then I'd like to focus on some of the things that we could do as we move forward that Ambassador Shin-wha can do with all of us. That said, I also would like to just mention something that Ambassador Robert King mentioned, that when I first became the ambassador, Bob, of course, was my counterpart in the US, and he was very helpful in giving me a lot of tips and advices as to how, what to do at the UN and so on. So I hope that soon there will be a successor to Ambassador King so that Ambassador Lee can have the synergy of having her counterpart in the US. So I hope this takes place very soon. The North Korean human rights issue took a back burner, I think primarily because of 5 factors. Number one, there's been a lack of accountability on Pyongyang by the UN and the international community. Number two, the previous government in South Korea, Moon Jae-in government, was too focused on peace initiatives, sort of Sunshine Policy 2.0, which exempted any mention of North Korean human rights because the previous government considered the human rights issue as an obstacle in making any progress with the North Korean government. Number three, the global attention was paid to Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambition and his persona. Number four, the previous US government, the Trump administration's ill-conceived personal charm diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. And number five, the COVID-19 effect, which has, among other things, significantly reduced the North Korean defectors coming out of North Korea. In the past 2 years, this year and last year, it's less than 100. Very, very insignificant. The situation is as dire as ever. The family reunion hasn't taken place, and as a result, a lot of the people who've applied for it are very advanced in their ages, 80s and 90s, and the number is dwindling. And it's a crime to deny them the opportunity to meet their families. Abduction of foreign nationals still continues. We've recently learned of the public execution of 3 teenagers, 2 of them for watching or distributing South Korean dramas. Torture, infanticide, forced abortion, all these things are continuing in North Korea. It's been trending the wrong way, and I'd like to list about 10 issues of the past 5 years under the Moon administration. Probably not exclusive, there are more, but these are my list. Number 1, we did not, for 3 years, from 2019, co-sponsor UN resolutions. Fortunately, the current government, the Yoon Suk-yeol government, has again decided to co-sponsor. So it's very important what position South Korea takes at the UN. After all, this is not someone else's problem. This is Korean problem, our own people. We should be at the harbinger of taking the initiatives, okay? Not getting on the bandwagon. And certainly not co-sponsoring was incomprehensible. Number 2, the previous government and now the opposition Democratic Party is still not honoring South Korea's North Korean human rights law. For example, the North Korean Human Rights Foundation is still not established because of the Democratic Party's opposition to it. And my successor, Ambassador Shin-wha, you know that it took 5 years for this succession to take place. Number 3, in 2019, November, North Korean defectors were forcibly repatriated to North Korea. I'm talking about the 2 North Korean fishermen who were sent back to the DPRK at Panmunjom, at the DMZ. This, to make the story short, this violated South Korea's constitution. It violated South Korea's North Korean Refugee Protection and Settlement Support Act, 이 북한 이탈 주민의 보호 및 정착 지원에 관한 법, and also South Korea's Supreme Court decisions. It was very inhumane and unconstitutional, to say the least. Number 4, we also know that in 2020, September, a South Korean official was shot dead and burned by North Korean naval troops. And there was a cover-up by the previous government. And the truth is only now beginning to come out as to what really happened. Because the previous government said that this official had intentions to defect to North Korea. The family has vehemently protested, saying that that was a lie. And that's coming to light recently. Number 5, anti-leaflet law, which violates the ICCPR. It violates the ICCPR because it clearly, the Article 19 of the ICCPR clearly states that the freedom of expression, which includes the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. Okay, regardless of frontiers. So he's allowed to do that. And South Korea, as a party to the ICCPR, should have should not have taken this step to make it unlawful to send leaflets. Number 6, some of the NGO members are here in South Korea. There's been an oppression of North Korean human rights NGOs in South Korea. All funding, government funding, had been cut off. And even businesses were too afraid to support North Korean human rights related NGOs. Number 7, silence on China's blatant forcible repatriation. We never even mentioned anything about this. Number 8, 3 summits with Kim Jong-un and not a word on North Korean human rights. Number 9, all government activities dealing with North Korean human rights, particularly the Foreign Ministry, Unification Ministry, National Intelligence Service, Justice Ministry, have been dwindled, if not eliminated. And finally, I think the Moon government was in part responsible also for President Trump's U-turn in his North Korea policy, because that was based on, if you remember, at the lawn of the White House, the South Korean National Security Advisor Jung and the NIS Director Hoon convincing President Trump that Kim Jong-un not only wants to meet him, but he's willing to give up his nuclear weapons. And that completely turned around the Trump administration policy towards the North. Moving forward, what can we do? I list about 10 also. Number 1, I think we should be very actively engaged in the UN forum. Number 2, and I'm very heartened that SG Ban Ki-moon actually mentioned this in his speech, we should keep pushing the UN Security Council for ICC referral. It might not happen, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. Number 3, we should continue to put pressure, we meaning in South Korea and also the international community, should put pressure on the Democratic Party in South Korea to comply with its agreement to follow up on the North Korean Human Rights Act. Number 4, we have to lodge a formal protest to Beijing for the forcible repatriation of North Koreans in China. Number 5, there is a Southeast Asian route, particularly Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. We have to make every diplomatic effort so that these countries can help more with the defectors coming their way from China. Number 7, we have to really convince the UNHCR to have access to the North Korean defectors in China. UNHCR has an agreement with China, and China is supposed to let UNHCR have access and interviews with the defectors so that they can determine whether they are refugees or simply illegal aliens. They're not allowing that. Number 8, and I know it's a long shot, but I hope that the UNHCR pushes for a refugee camp for the defectors in China, or I heard earlier that the Mongolian ambassador is here, possibly also in Mongolia. It might not take place right away, but at least, they are refugees. Why not a refugee camp for the refugees in China, North Korean refugees? Or China can save face by periodically announcing amnesty for what they consider to be illegal aliens. I think that would also help. Number 9, I really think that personally that a global campaign agenda has to benchmark anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Okay? It's funny that we want improvement in North Korean human rights, and yet we're so eager to engage North Korea in sporting and culture. And I mean, I still have all these people talking about, oh, FIFA should be, should try to contact North Korean, the soccer team so that, we can hold these like sporting events and so on. Is that what happened with South Africa, with apartheid? No, it's just the opposite. South Africa was prevented from partaking in any sporting events internationally or any cultural event. In fact, South Africa was prevented from even engaging in committees and subcommittees of the United Nations since 1974. We know what happens in 1994. So it took 2 decades before Nelson Mandela becomes the president and the apartheid system became eradicated. So it's that kind of global will and hardballing, if we are serious about seeing improvements in North Korean human rights situation. There are other possibilities as well. The UN General Assembly Resolution 377, universal jurisdiction, mobilizing celebrities, and I hope maybe Ambassador Lee can do that. I failed to do that. I contacted a lot of Hollywood stars, but no response. Maybe better luck with you. But finally, and I think this is something that Minister Kwon Yongse has mentioned, that if we really truly want a peaceful reunification or peaceful peninsular issue, we have to have a resolution not just only on North Korea's nuclear issues, but human rights issues as well. If there's a resolution on the nuclear weapons and North Korea's human rights situation, problem solved. And therefore, that's why South Korea and the international community, in dealing with North Korea, have to target these two problems, nuclear issue and human rights. Because when there's a resolution on those, we will have peace on the peninsula and East Asia as a whole. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your very extensive and very helpful analysis of what went wrong and now what we have to do. I take all the notes and hopefully I can do something out of that together with you and your help. Well, probably our American fellows who are in online can help me to approach to those actors or actresses in Hollywood to promote the campaigns. But particularly, I would like to emphasizing the importance of those co-sponsorship of South Korean government, regardless of the political leadership, is very important. As you said, it is our Korean problems that we can address, and I'm deeply impressed and agree with what you said. Okay, the next panelist is who's been long supported my work as a both professor as an ambassador, and Victor Cha, who's been also very helpful for me for my first 4 months of this new job. Thank you so much for your help and continued support I will depend on. And would you talk about your view on, as a person who's been working on security issue as well, what do you think about North Korea human rights issue has to be addressed and how and why? Victor? Cha?
Yep. Yes, thank you. Well, thank you, Ambassador Lee, for having me join you remotely from Washington, D.C. Thank you also to the Unification Minister, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and a good friend Hoon for all of your remarks thus far, as well as Ambassador King's. They've really been quite good. I thought what I do with my short remarks is just take us back a little bit in the history of how this mattered for U.S. policy, even before the COI, even before the Commission of Inquiry, and then bring it back to the present with regard to how we might think about approaching it going forward. So first, I think it goes without saying that for too long, human rights abuses in North Korea have been cast aside for so-called higher priorities in U.S. policy. But the reality is that when unification comes, when unification of the Korean Peninsula comes one day and all is revealed, we will all be witness to one of the worst human rights abuses in modern world history. In terms of US policy, North Korean human rights has traditionally not been a high priority in our policy towards North Korea. The primary focus has been on the security threat in two dimensions. The first is conventional deterrence, and the second is denuclearization. On conventional deterrence, we've been quite successful because there hasn't been a second attempt by the North to invade South Korea. So conventional deterrence has worked. On the second, however, we've not been successful at all, despite agreements reached in 1994 and 2005, the summits in 2017, 2018, 2019. North Korea has not been denuclearized. If anything, its arsenal has only grown over time. Human rights has not played a large role in US negotiations. It was never an explicit part of the US negotiating strategy for the last major agreement we got, which was the six-party talks in 2005, 2007. The only place it had a role was in our bilateral working group. The six-party joint statement created 5 working groups, one of which was a US DPRK working group that was tasked with discussing the issues that needed to be resolved in order for there to be a normalization of political relations between the two countries. As you can imagine, the North Korean side had a to-do list that focused largely on lifting economic sanctions. But on the US to-do list were not just North Korean missiles, conventional force deployments, but also human rights. That was explicitly on our list in the bilateral working group, but we really never had the opportunity to have an explicit discussion about human rights. Instead, as Ambassador King knows well, the primary vehicle for bringing North Korean human rights abuses onto the radar screen was the US Congress. In March of 2004, passage of the North Korean Human Rights Act for the first time called for the appointment of this special envoy. But even then, that first envoy was Jay Lefkowitz. The envoy didn't have a real role in US policy because when the United States was in nuclear negotiations with North Korea, policymakers did not want to raise the human rights issue for fear of crippling the negotiations. So it was only when the US was not engaged in negotiations on the nuclear program that there was less opposition to talking about human rights. The effectiveness of the US Special Envoy was also complicated by the politics in South Korea. At that time, there was a progressive government in the South under President Roh Moo-hyun that was not welcoming and pushing hard on the human rights issue. I think it's important to note that at this time, there was one voice on human rights in the US government that did try to make an impact, and that was the president himself, President George W. Bush. He met with North Korean defectors in the Oval Office. He allowed pictures to be released of him meeting with North Koreans and with the parents of Japanese abductees in the Oval Office. There was no story that went with the picture because he didn't want to upset the nuclear negotiations, but the picture itself was just released and it spread like wildfire across international media. But it was not only that, but when the president takes up the issue, it becomes international almost automatically in a way that no other NGO or any other group could possibly match. When the president talks about the stories of North Korean defectors at the G8, then it was the G8, or the UN General Assembly, soon it's become household stories for all world leaders. It was already mentioned that the United States has done other things like starting the first refugee resettlement program outside of South Korea, a food assistance program, children's vaccination programs, increased funding for radio broadcasting, among other things. And these are all important efforts because, as one North Korean defector said to me, if the United States, if America doesn't stand up for abused people in North Korea, then what other country in the world would even care? Still, as we all know, the United States needs to do better to integrate human rights into our overall policy. We certainly can't give up on the goal of denuclearization. But I would push back against the notion that there is a zero-sum relationship between denuclearization and human rights. On the contrary, I think pushing for human rights reforms in North Korea could actually help with our denuclearization negotiations in three ways. And so now I'm bringing us back to the present and looking forward in terms of how we should think about these two. My bottom line is that I think whether you are a hardliner or a softliner on North Korea, you should be moving forward with a human rights upfront policy or strategy when it comes to dealing with North Korea. If you're a softliner, which may seem counterintuitive to the narrative, policy narrative that we've seen, if you're a softliner on North Korea, you should actually be talking about human rights for two reasons. The first is that there is such a lack of credibility with regard to North Korean actions and statements in the denuclearization space. North Korea has violated past agreements so many times that no one really believes their commitments anymore. And even if we were to freeze their nuclear tests and start to dismantle their facilities, no one believes that commitment is real or long-term. There's a basic problem of credibility. But if North Korea were to take these actions on denuclearization that are familiar to us, but in the context of an improvement in their human rights situation, then those same denuclearization moves would be seen in a different context and could possibly be seen as being even more credible, even though we've seen them break these commitments before. So there is a relationship between the decisions they take on human rights that lends more credence to anything that happens on the denuclearization front. Second, there's a direct relationship between human rights and economic assistance to North Korea. The basic quid pro quo for North Korean denuclearization has been the provision of economic assistance, energy assistance, food assistance. But the reality is, at least in the United States, we cannot deliver those things even if they take steps on denuclearization, because current US law makes it very difficult for companies to become involved in North Korea when there are these blatant human rights abuses in the supply chain. So again, the point is, even if you're a soft liner on North Korea, human rights reforms are critical to making any sort of deal. Finally, if you're a hardliner on North Korea, and not everybody will agree with this, but if you're a hardliner on North Korea, speaking about the human rights situation and the basic breakdown in the social contract between the government and the social welfare of the people is something that is really the Achilles heel of this regime. They become most concerned when we make statements about their human rights abuses. They could care less if we add more sanctions or if we talk about the illegitimacy of the regime or talk about denuclearization. They've heard that a million times. They don't really care about that. But when we talk about their human rights abuses, or when we try to bring information into the country to the North Korean people, these are the things that are most worrisome to the regime. So again, the bottom line is, whether you're a hardliner or a softliner on North Korea, you should be taking a human rights upfront approach. The final thing I want to say is just to reiterate what my friend Ambassador Hoon said about China and forced repatriation. I firmly believe that any US government policy has to make reference to ending China's practice of forced repatriation. We know that they have been actively engaged in this, despite the fact that they are a signatory to these UN conventions, the Refugee Convention and the protocol, the 1967 protocol. And yet they, since 2001, have blatantly cracked down harshly in broad sweeps of towns, providing rewards and all these sorts of things. This is a horrible practice that both the North Koreans and the Chinese collude to keep quiet. The victims in this regard are nameless and faceless. We never see them. They are not humans. They are just statistics. And in this regard, I wish the United States and the South Korean government would do more to try to personalize the forced repatriation issue by trying to put names and faces to individuals around which you can build a cause. That is sort of the way the United States has approached some of the human rights issues with China. naming an individual and what they stood for. The United States did this once in 2006 when they released a statement on Kim Jun-hee, who was forced repatriation by the Chinese even after the UNHCR had asked about this individual. The Chinese basically lied to the representative for the UNHCR and forcibly repatriated this person. Putting names and faces to these cases makes them more understandable to the general public rather than just being a statistic. So let me stop there. And again, thank Ambassador Shin-wha for organizing this. We're all here in the U.S. greatly elated when we heard that she has taken on this position for the Yoon administration, and I, along with all of my American colleagues, have been asking the administration on nearly a daily basis where they are on the appointment of Shin-hwa's counterpart, because there, as Bob said, there is no disagreement between Republicans and Democrats on North Korean human rights. So there really isn't an excuse for this to have taken so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor Cha. Thank you for sharing those vivid experience of under the U.S. government in terms of the policy on North Korean human rights issue, particularly while you are in the government. And also thank you for your talks and thought about hardline information, giving us the information about hardline and soft line on North Korean human rights issue. And also I'm glad you reiterating the Ambassador Lee Jung-un's remark on the North Korean the refugee issues in China, what we need to do. In particular, you say the personalizing, not only number, but a person is, I think, a very important thing to say. And also, I would like to share the information as well that both U.S. state government as well as the White House said they are completely on the same page to talk about the importance of appointing the special envoy. And hopefully, the good news will come sooner or later. Thank you so much, Victor. And last but not least, I would like to invite our panelist, who is the most promising and rising scholar on the Korean and also East Asian issues, who have been also very strong the dedications to North Korean human rights issues, including the defector issue. So here comes the Andrea. Andy.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee, and I feel so honored to participate on this panel with other distinguished guests. I'd like to offer my sincere thanks and congratulations to the Ministry of Unification and also Ambassador Shin-wha Lee and all those who helped organize today's international dialogue on North Korean human rights. I hope it's just one of a series of events that will come to fruition. And I also want to commend the Yoon government for bringing back human rights as a serious issue in South Korea. Lee, I know Ambassador Jung Lee laid out the absence of this issue for the time being, but I'm glad that it's come back onto the radar. And I really do hope that there is a US counterpart to Ambassador Lee, as everyone else has mentioned. If there's anyone listening in the actual audience or in the virtual audience on the American side, I think this is an extremely important issue if we really want to address North Korean human rights here from the United States. I'm going to address three main points in my remarks. I know I don't have much time, but in my three points, first, I want to acknowledge the difficult political environment we currently exist in and the challenges confronting North Korean human rights advocates around the world. And then second, I'll offer some thoughts on what direction the international community should be moving in regarding North Korean human rights. And then lastly, I'll offer a brief reflection on a post-pandemic North Korea, because honestly, we are somewhat limited until North Korea begins to ease its border restrictions. Okay, in terms of the challenge and issues, I know that Ambassador Lee and a few others had pointed out what these challenges are, but these days, issues other than North Korean human rights seems to be drawing international attention. within the Korean Peninsula, there's escalating security tensions on the Korean Peninsula, especially the last 2 months. We've seen a record number of North Korean missile tests this year. And that means that security issues have been vaulted to the forefront while human rights have been put on the back burner once again. Meanwhile, North Korea's border lockdown and non-response to humanitarian assistance, including COVID-19 vaccines, has made it much harder for human rights advocates and humanitarian groups to conduct their work. There's much less attention that means to North Korean human rights. And researchers like myself have to now work with fewer data points as the number of defectors has come down significantly since the pandemic. It means there's an information vacuum from North Korea, and it's been exacerbated by the near absence of the international aid community and reduced diplomatic presence in North Korea. And then, of course, outside of the Korean Peninsula, there's Russia's invasion of Ukraine and related mass atrocities in that conflict, human rights violations in Xinjiang, tensions created by US-China competition. And all these things have drawn the immediate attention of the international community. So these are just some of the domestic and international hurdles facing the North Korean human rights community as we approach the 10th anniversary of launching the UN Commission of Inquiry on North Korea. And I think much of the world is now aware of North Korean human rights violations, but that momentum has stalled due to the pandemic, due to other global pressing issues that have risen to the forefront, and also due to the acute security tensions that have brought light to North Korean weapons rather than the suffering of the North Korean people. So when we compare the number of conferences, forums, and events held in Washington, DC, and Seoul, and then elsewhere from a decade ago to today, there just seems to be much less activity and attention on North Korean human rights. And so that's something that I hope that we can correct and that we can build on now that we have you appointed, Ambassador Lee, and also as we see some of the pandemic, as we see the world moving beyond the pandemic. But where are we heading next? So that's my next point. Given this difficult political environment, where should the international community go? And here I want to just draw on some of the work that I've done on North Korean human rights advocacy networks and activists, along with another researcher in Australia, Danielle Chubb. I know Joanna is in the audience, or she's going to be in the second panel, so she would participate in that project. So some of those ideas are drawn there, where we think about the network of human rights advocates and activists. And we have to remember that the network of human rights advocacy exists at the domestic and international level. So that's, I know that many of us are in that space, so we're aware of that, but for those who are not as familiar with this issue, there is a domestic and an international level for advocacy. And of course, the focus on advocacy has shifted towards the international or the transnational space over time. But in South Korea, oftentimes the focus is on South Korean activists or North Korean defectors working on human rights issues. But there are human rights groups operating in the United States, in Japan, in the UK, continental Europe, and Canada, Australia. So there are multiple North Korean human rights groups that are active. Someone had mentioned earlier the college campuses. I remember both in my undergrad and graduate institution that there would be events. There'd be a chapter of Liberty in North Korea link operating on our campus. And so those are networks that I think can be reactivated. But these networks, they have their own agenda, but they can push their governments and parliament to address North Korean human rights issues. Sometimes it's easy to forget that while advocating on behalf of North Korean human rights in Korea or in the United States or in Japan, that there are parallel movements operating in different countries. And of course, there are also the international organizations and coalitions. These ties and networks may have atrophied during the pandemic, but again, that's the momentum that needs to be rebuilt to reactivate these vertical and horizontal networks. And I think the 10th anniversary of the UNCOI may be one opportunity to perhaps revitalize these networks. I think this forum, this dialogue today is one of the ways where we can begin to build momentum And admittedly, usually there's some external event or shock that needs to galvanize support, such as the terrible case of Otto Warmbier, which led to more direct intervention and action on the part of human rights groups in the United States. But we do want to see these horizontal and vertical networks reactivated. And we also have to cast a wider net. I know Professor Cha talked about softliners and hardliners. I have a different way of phrasing this, but there's always been some tension between groups interested in engagement work in North Korea and those who are focused more on accountability. And on one hand, there are organizations that address humanitarian and development needs, which often require working with North Korean counterparts. And then on the other hand, there are activists and advocacy organizations that are there to denounce the regime and to call for accountability or to call for more subversive means to change human rights, the human rights situation in North Korea. And these two networks or these two groups can be in tension. But I just want to say, when North Korea's border lockdown eases, and it's going to eventually ease, it can't last forever. There's going to be a demand, or at least a desire, for some groups to increase humanitarian assistance and resume people-to-people engagement work. And these groups must be included within the broader human rights framework to the extent that they are addressing human security and humanitarian needs facing ordinary North Koreans. And this was recognized already by the UNCOI. So I want to say that we have to embrace both these top-down and bottom-up approaches to bringing about human rights change. And that's, some of us are more comfortable working in formal institutional channels, whether through the UN or the European Union or through our respective governments to press North Korea to change its human rights behavior. But then there are others that believe that the best way to bring about change is to work from the bottom up. That means supporting civil society and defector groups in their efforts to send more outside information into North Korea, to promote market activity, to promote entrepreneurs, especially North Korean women, working in the Jangmadang. So there are these different modalities, working through international organizations or working from the bottom up, supporting defectors. There are multiple ways to address this, and I just want to highlight that. And although there's tension that exists across these different approaches, I think we as a group who care about North Korean human rights have to find the humility to admit that there is no single right approach to bringing about human rights change, and to be open and mindful of these different tactics and strategies. Now, finally, in a post-pandemic North Korea, what's that going to look like? So as China's now easing their zero COVID policy, following protests, and North Korea may also follow suit and ease COVID restrictions as well as it gets its signals from China. And so in 2023, I expect to see growth in Chinese-North Korea trade, maybe some improvement in the formal economy. But that being said, North Korea's informal economy and markets, unfortunately, are going to take longer to revive. Something like activities like smuggling across the border, it's going to be much more difficult with tighter control at the border. And I think there have been some images or reports that there are COVID checkpoints that are coming, that are being built on the Russia-North Korea border, perhaps on the China-North Korea border, which means that there are North Koreans in China and Russia that are going to come back to North Korea. But if they're going to have these checkpoints or quarantine facilities, it's going to be, there might be some health justification for it, but we have to be vigilant that, this could also be ways of the regime controlling the flow of people, making sure that there isn't, propaganda or, or South Korean dramas coming in through the border. But because of the stricter lockdown and difficulty for getting information, at least across the Sino-North Korea border, there may need to be greater attention, at least initially, on things like humanitarian needs or food security, malnutrition, public health. And these are issues that the regime might actually seek to address rather than outright reject. At the same time, I also think the international community and the South Korean government should do more to support defectors and defector organizations in their endeavor to bring about positive change for the North Korean people, including greater information and knowledge from the outside world. So these initiatives should be supported. I know they weren't funded under the previous government, but this is something that I think is extremely important. However, we need to find ways to leverage the extra attention given to North Korean security issues, which is, I think, right now the world is really paying. When they think about North Korea, they think about missiles and nuclear tests. But we have to tie that into the issue of North Korean human rights, as Professor Chiar and others had mentioned. There really can be no peace or security on the regime as long as the North Korean people are oppressed and deprived of basic rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for introducing and explaining us the various activities of NGOs. And also you said there is no single approach to deal with the North Korean human rights issues. And also thank you for informing and giving us your thought on the COVID-19 situation in North Korea and etc. But we only have 10 minutes left. But let me just briefly raise the questions to each panelist and then open up the floor for some more than a couple of people. To Ambassador Robert King, you often mention about the importance of the cooperation among like-minded countries, like let's say US and Europe and the Korea. So what kind of suggestion you would offer for those like-minded countries to consolidating their solidarity to improve the North Korean human rights issue? And Professor Shin-wha, you talk about the importance of a political consensus and public awareness. Since you are in college, what kind of advice and also the suggestion you would like to offer for the younger generations who can promote their awareness of the importance of the North Korean human rights issues? And Professor Lee Jung-hoon, you highlighting the importance of the accountability, but can you also give us some thought of how we can combine this kind of accountability together with humanitarian assistance, since that is a very important tool to improve the human right and livelihood of the ordinary North Korean people? And Victor Cha, having you just give us a very insightful analysis and story about the US policy on North Korean human rights issues, can you give us your suggestion and recommendations to US government how to mainstreaming the human rights issues in US foreign policy or North Korean policy? And the last for the Andy, I believe that you've been working for interview with North Korean defectors in Korea. So can you just give us some thought after the what you learned from those interviews and what kind of suggestion you can give to us?
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I have to go for other events. As I mentioned in my presentation, there's a lot of interest among college students in American universities. Okay, so I think this is one good area of collaboration, between Korean and American, college students. So I mean, they are the future of course, our society. And I think this is maybe a good project. In my own view, I'm teaching, here at Stanford. So I think this may be a good area to explore engaging young people in US and Korea, and maybe even other countries as well, like European countries or Japan and so on. So I strongly suggest that you may pursue this project in the coming years. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Robert King?
Thank you very much. The discussion has been very interesting. There have been some very good comments, and I appreciate being able to participate in this discussion. With regard to the comments and questions that you raised, Ambassador Lee, there does definitely need to be an effort to reach out beyond just the United States and South Korea. Our two countries have worked together on the human rights issue. We've had very close relations. But I think it's particularly important that we reach through the United Nations to the other countries that participate in the Human Rights Council and other UN activities. But I think it's also important to focus on some of these other countries, the European countries, Japan, where there's an interest and a concern in human rights to encourage and try to move things forward in that regard. One of the things that I did as special envoy was to make a point of visiting the European Parliament, meeting with the Human Rights Commission, Committee of the European Parliament. I met with parliamentarians in London, in Berlin, and various other countries to raise these issues and make sure there was support in democratic countries elsewhere. And I think part of the importance of this is if we're going to make progress in the UN bodies, we need to make sure that UN members are also involved in this. One of the things that I think is particularly important is working with non-government organizations, NGOs, particularly human rights groups. Again, they play a very important role because of the connections they have, because of their efforts and work with the United Nations, but also elsewhere. The other thing that we need to consider as part of this effort on human rights is dealing with the humanitarian concerns and needs in North Korea and working with groups and organizations that are involved in humanitarian efforts in North Korea is important. The human rights has to be not only a concern for what happens in terms of legal norms, but also in terms of access to medical care, access to food, improving conditions and opportunities there. And I think the humanitarian concern is something we need to look at as well. I've probably gone on too long. We're short on time, but thank you very much for the discussion, and thank you very much for the interest and focus on human rights. It's something we've not had for a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Lee Jung-woon. But before then, Victor and Andy, probably we have one online questions of what the impact of the sanction on North Korean against North Korea on the human rights issues. If you can reply to that, it would be appreciated, Lee Jung-woon. Yes.
Okay. So I'll be very brief on your question about accountability and how to balance accountability and humanitarian assistance. I don't think they're mutually exclusive at all. And just because you focus on accountability, that does not in any way preclude humanitarian assistance. My thing is that, that said, all humanitarian assistance to North Korea, which should continue, should certainly be verifiable, and that it should not be in full control of the Pyongyang regime, where it can take advantage of whatever we send. Also, another thing is that if it is something that the North Korean regime is in need, in dire straits, then let's at least try to link that to some extent to human rights conditions. Maybe not the nuclear issue, because that's much bigger issue that should be handled at the UN Security Council level. But even incrementally, even small matters of the human rights violation situations, I think that we can at least raise that. But I don't think we've ever done that, even with the humanitarian assistance. 저 아까 질문한 걸 답을 할까요, 저분?
Is it okay to provide an answer? Okay. I will be brief. You talked about North Korean defectors from China. That's why when I made the presentation, I talked about routes in Laos, Vietnam, Thailand. So to stop repatriation, we need to make some diplomatic efforts, which have not been seen for many years. So we need to reactivate such efforts to prevent repatriation from China. And regarding repatriation, President Xi or the Beijing I have never talked about it because they don't like it. But not talking about it just because you don't like it is a nonsense. We have the right to talk about it. And In 1951, Refugees Convention was established at the UN, and 67, the protocol was established. If you look at them, the most important one is refugees. Even though you are not refugees, but after leaving the country, you become refugee. So in that regard, we need to press UNHCR more and harder. Of course, it can be done by NGO as well, but we need to take a governmental approach to that issue. Thank you very much for your answer.
I'm sorry, I can only give you 1 minute with the 2 questions, right? Victor?
Okay, I'll be very quick. So one, I think that for the so there are 2 recommendations. One is for the UN administration that given the focus on renewed focus on human rights and freedom as a core value of the UN administration's foreign policy, that they should consider the creation of a sort of foundation for democracy and human rights, of which North Korean human rights can be a part of that, I think, but it should be broader than just North Korea. And for the Biden administration, I think they should pick up where Lee Jong-hoon left off in terms of trying to recruit a famous personality, Hollywood actor, actress, to take up the mantle of human rights in North Korea. The situation with China is very different today between the US and China than it was when Ambassador Lee Jong-hoon was doing this. And I think that was probably one of the reasons why many actors and actresses shied away, because they thought it would offend the Chinese and hurt their market in China. That's much less of a concern today, given the state of US-China relations. So I would suggest that we continue with that effort. And I'm on the board of the National Endowment for Democracies in Washington, D.C., and we're trying to do that.
Thank you. And if we can talk about impact of the sanction on human rights issue, might be good, since we had a question from online.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm not sure in what context that was raised, but there's sometimes concerns that sanctions are giving more hardship to North Koreans. But I would just counter that and say that of course, at the end of the day, first, sanctions aren't being very well enforced, and the pandemic lockdown is having a much stronger impact on North Korea than the sanctions. But even then, I always think that the reason why we have sanctions in part is because of the North Korean regime's abuses and its rights violations. And even when there weren't sanctions, it wasn't as if the country were living that well either. So that would be my response. But the sanctions, it may be having some impact on the daily lives of people, especially as I look at markets for the defectors. It may be harder to get goods and other things that basic necessities into North Korea. But I wouldn't say that that's the core reason why North Korea is in the situation that it's in.
Thank you very much. Well, I failed to keep the time, so sorry about that to organizers. But so this is the end of the first session, and thank you so much. And it's very late night for our distinguished American participants. So thank you so much for everything, and this is the end.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador Lee and panelists, for the great discussion. So this is the end of the first session. We're going to have a very short break, and so the second session will resume at 11:20. So coffee is out there. Please be hydrated and caffeinated.
Thank you very much, and welcome back. Well, the previous session, we are highlighting the issues and challenges and tasks for the North Korean human rights issue, and all those scholars who's been working on this issue, we've been discussing about those part. And this second session, I want to, while we still talk about issues and challenges and tasks, I would like to put a little bit more focus on the role of international community and civil society. So for that, we have another 5 distinguished scholars and activists here. So I would like to, without my further remark on the issue, since I spent enough time for the first session, I will just directly move on to the panelists so that we can have a more time for discussion later on. And the first speaker, and I'm honored to have a president and professor, Dr. Kim Eun-mi, who's been a role model for me. And she's gonna be, despite her very busy schedule as a president of Ewha Women's University, she squeezed her time to come over here to spend some time with us for this important event. So thank you so much again. And I would like to give a floor to the Professor Kim and President Kim. She's been writing a very good article on the women and the children's issue in regards to the public health as well. And then she's going to talk about that issue and as well as some importance of the assistance of the North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important conference. I feel very honored to be able to speak. I'm a sociologist by training, and I've been working on international development cooperation. So my attention has been in the developing world, and I've been working on development cooperation in general. And I haven't really looked into North Korea issues because North Korea, if you're in the Republic of Korea, is not really subject to our international development cooperation. But recently, I've been interested in North Korean issues because at the end, our development cooperation efforts, we hope that our networks in international development field, in international organizations, in international NGOs will be helpful when the day comes when we will work with North Korea with international humanitarian assistance and international development cooperation, although our assistance and help with North Korea will not be counted toward our ODA, but it doesn't matter. I think where and when there will be need, we will be there to help with our international networks and help. So with that in mind, we have been interested in North Korean issues. And let me put three things forward. First, we're very concerned about human rights issues in North Korea, both for North Koreans and North Korean defectors. Second, we're very concerned about health issues. Health is an important issue for us to be concerned if we are to think about reunification and peace for both Koreas, not just for the Republic of Korea, not just for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's for both Koreas. And finally, for women and children. They're very vulnerable, but also need empowerment, support, and education empowerment needed for women and children. In 2007 and 2018, there was this euphoria, sense of euphoria, when the dialogue between the US and DPRK was going forward as if the reunification was right around the corner. And when that was progressing, there was some concern about health issues. There was concern that about what if reunification occurs very abruptly? What about communicable diseases for both Koreas? It wasn't just about ROK being vulnerable. It was also about DPRK being very vulnerable to communicable diseases that may come from South Korea with the healthcare system that was still very inadequate. So it's for both Koreas' health issues that was not being discussed but needed to be put up front. The other issue that really concerned us is the Ministry of Unification put out a report in 2019 that 2018, the share of women defectors from North Korea reached an all-time high of 85%. Yet in the news, in the political limelight, we only heard about male defectors, very high-profile male defectors, and we did not hear about women defectors or young girls who are risking their lives to come to South Korea. And many of these young women ended up coming to Ewha. So I learned about them and had to care about them because I was meeting them in person. Some of them were brave enough to tell me their stories, but many of them were not able to tell me their stories. They were hidden. So who are these women? What are their health risks? I learned this in a very difficult way because many of these young women were entering colleges with scholarships and so on. They were getting into health-related majors, nursing, public health, medicine, pharmacology, if they had the opportunity. They wanted to be helpful to women like them who needed medical help foremost. Many of these young women, unlike the male counterparts, when they come to South Korea, they all get medical checkups through Hanawan and so on. But the first thing they did after they had the dental checkup is to go to OBGYN. Every one of them, every one of them, and for various reasons. So in March 2019, we had a conference at EHWA on North Korean women and children's health, challenges and future prospects. We had Professor John Linton, better known in Korea as In Yo-han, director of the International Healthcare Center of Severance Hospital, professor of the College of Medicine at Yongse. He was former president of the Korean Foundation for International Healthcare, KOFI. We had Il-ha, the founder and chairperson of the Good Neighbors International, a South Korean NGO, international NGO, and he was providing a lot of assistance to North Korea. Was not very well known because he couldn't do that very publicly, but he was providing a lot of assistance to North Korea. Pravin Agarwal, who was the representative and country director at the time of UN World Food Program in DPRK. And we had panelists who were North Korean defector women who had become nurses and who had become medical doctors in South Korea and Hanawan staff. We talked about the health status of North Koreans and also the North Korean defector women who came to Korea, their journey and their issues with sexual and reproductive health issues and concerns. The children's health issues and concerns. So at the end, the policy recommendations that we had, when at the time, you have to remember this was in early 2019, there was still hope that things will improve between the two Koreas. That we wanted to shed some light on women and children's rights. We want to shed light on the health rights, and we want to be able to train women defectors who are already in Korea to have them be prepared and ready when the day of the unification would come. I know this may be in the greater far distance in the future, but with COVID and other health risks that we face nowadays, this may be something that we need to rekindle and think about. The health rights, how we prepare the future generations for these issues. I want us to think about being able to provide the networks in international organizations, international NGOs, how we need to educate and train our future generations, including the South Koreans, but also North Korean defectors, and hopefully North Koreans. These are all related to the basic human rights, health rights, and also I want to think about us to think about the women and children who seem to fall through the cracks when we talk about human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the President Kim nicely talked about the importance of those vulnerable groups, particularly women and children. President Kim, the UN Seoul UN office is preparing together with the UN Special Rapporteur Elizabeth Selman on these women issues of the North Korean human rights issue at the end of the January. So hopefully that you can join us and give us a good, nice talks as well. Thank you so much. And next panelist will be Mr. James Heenan, who is the director of the UN Human Rights Seoul office, who is pretty newer than me, right? And he has a very large experience on the humanitarian crisis activities in Palestine and other places. And maybe you know that you have a very good expectations and a good word from the South Korean NGO community already. So we look forward to working with you. And today, it would be nice if we can talk about what's your view on North Korean human rights issue and what your office can do for us.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee. Thank you to the Ministry for the invitation, and also Ambassador Lee, who is the driving force behind this. I think I can still say I'm new. I think that invitation will eventually go, but I'm still relatively new. I'd like to talk, first of all, briefly about what civil society means for us in the UN in this context. In every context we work, not just in human rights, but particularly in human rights, civil society is key for our work in all these countries. They are here in the context of DPRK. Civil society have proven themselves as the driving force between the biggest advancements we've had, the appointment of a special rapporteur, the creation of the Commission of Inquiry. All of these were the result of strong and coordinated advocacy by civil society. It's a bit of a paradox that there's effectiveness in that, but the actual situation in North Korea doesn't seem to be progressing. In fact, it seems to be regressing. In the absence of civil society in DPRK itself, we in the office rely on those civil society organizations here to get the information and document the violations so that we can provide the international community with an up-to-date information on what is happening. Many of the civil society here are led by SKPs, which means that there is a family or organic link with the issue, which results in extremely committed organizations here. I won't talk about the services that they provide, but obviously that's of interest to us as well, because we don't just talk about what's happening in DPRK, we talk about what happens to people from DPRK wherever they are. Civil society also, there's this sense that there's no engagement with North Korea or no opportunity for engagement with North Korea. And yeah, it was me who said it was a black box at the moment, but there are institutional mechanisms in the UN that allow for civil society and other governments to input to or to give comment on the human rights situation in the North. We have DPRK coming up for the Universal Periodic Review in the Human Rights Council in 2024. That civil society can input to that. And there's also, we expect the UN Committee on Persons with Disabilities to review DPRK also in 2024, and I have high hopes that the government in the North will engage with that process. There are many others, the voluntary review of the SDGs, where it seems that the DPRK government is interested in being engaged, and also just working with the UN country team when it returns. As one of the previous panelists said, North Korea wants a seat at the international table. It wants its sovereignty respected. It wants respect generally. And one of the key tables at the international level at the moment is the human rights table. Civil society help us in our mandated work. So in our office, we monitor the human rights situation, monitor and report on the human rights situation. We look at accountability pathways, where we can undo this problem of accountability, as previous speakers have spoken. We do consultations with stakeholders, not just SKPs, but also government and academia and others, which is a very important part of our mandate and will accelerate in the coming year. And we maintain an information database, a central repository, and CSOs are key to this. What we want to have, what we're mandated to do, is to maintain a place where information on North Korea, and as scarce as it may be today, is safely kept in a database, in a secure database that can be used in future accountability efforts. Many of the elements on human rights in North Korea are buffeted, are affected by the international political situation. And we've talked about the referral to the ICC as a possibility for accountability. I can't see that happening anytime soon. I also can't see an ad hoc tribunal being created anytime soon, although both of those things have been certainly recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry, but also of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we will continue to push for those, and as does civil society. But there are other mechanisms that can be used in the meantime, and civil society have been enormously effective in using, for example, the working group on involuntary and enforced disappearances. As of May, I think we had the working group had received and transmitted to DPRK, just under 400 cases on involuntary and enforced disappearance. Little surprise that none of those cases have been resolved, as the language of the working group goes, but it keeps the issue up and it keeps it present. And in fact, the office will be publishing a report on enforced disappearance in the coming weeks. The other thing I mentioned was what we do on accountability. This is the key thing which we're all trying to find our way through. I think civil society have done much of the thinking. If the ICC and ad hoc tribunals are not so politically feasible at the moment, there are others. There's universal jurisdiction, as someone mentioned. Of course, officials from DPRK don't leave the country very much these days. But there's also prosecutions in country, and here I would say, including here in the Republic of Korea, there are opportunities to pursue accountability. It will take a long time, and I think the previous speakers were very clear about this. Don't expect something overnight, but if we don't put the groundwork down now, it will take many decades to get there. I'd like just to finish by expressing my own thanks to our civil society colleagues, because without them in this job, but also in many countries in my previous jobs, it's almost impossible for a human rights office to be effective without a strong and vibrant civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your introducing, explaining the work of your office, as well as you point out for absence of the NGO within North Korea is also the problematic as well. So maybe you can briefly talk about what your office and NGO here in South Korea can do together to improve some situation in North Korea. Do you have any kind of things ongoing?
Well, there's a few things. First of all, we share our perspectives regularly. I've rarely worked in a place where we are as close to NGOs as we are here. Everyone's doing the same thinking. It's a waste of time for us all to do it in silos. The second thing is the information. There's a lot of information out there, and we are working with our civil society partners to collate that information and maybe to make sure that it is the most useful format, the most useful information possible for potential accountability mechanisms in the future. The third thing is advocacy, and I didn't mention this, but in this time when things on DPRK have never been, well, I don't know, I'm new, but seem to be very, very difficult, the risk is that the human rights story falls off the agenda. And it's not just DPRK. I mean, other crises in the world are drawing the attention away from other chronic human rights situations. But I see it as a major role of our office, together with our civil society partners, to keep human rights on the agenda and to actually be quite annoying about it, so that people can't ignore it, because it's too easy to ignore, including amongst the population in the Republic of Korea.
Great, thank you. So having said that, I will just move on to our next panelists, who are the NGOs who are working in, and of course in outside as well, in Korea. The Ms. Ioanna Hosanak, who is the Deputy Director General in Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, who's been long time committed NGO person who was virtually in a hidden power to push for the establishment of the COI back in 2013. Well, I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you again for doing those wonderful jobs. So you have a floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee. Thank you for inviting me here, and also I would like to thank the Ministry of Unification for organizing this meeting. And as Ambassador Lee mentioned, actually this December, just a few days ago, this is 10 years since I took 2 victims, and together with a friend who was at the time the director of the Geneva office of Human Rights Watch, we met for the first time with Navi Pillai, at that time the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it was the first time when NGOs and the victims of North Korean human rights abuses were able, even though we were advocating for a very long time to establish such meeting. This is where we provided the petition submitted and signed by thousands of people around the world on South Korean unresolved abduction issue and other nationals abducted by North Korea, but also asked Navi Pillai to actually issue a statement on the requirement and the need to establish the Commission of Inquiry. That was exactly 10 years ago. And so I would like to kind of make a summary of what I see is going a little bit wrong, similarly to what former Ambassador Lee mentioned. And this will also involve, as he said, this is still a Korean problem and will involve a South Korea responsibility on this issue. But I also would like to reiterate what James just mentioned before, because he was present in so many different settings where there is political also division in many countries. And still in these countries, the witness testimony and the documentation is an absolute foundation of any type of accountability processes, of reparations and other types of processes that take place. In any country around the world, I mention this because still we are, sometimes facing the kind of questioning of North Koreans and the North Koreans' testimonies and the stories that they bring from North Korea by Western scholars, South Korean scholars, certain members in the political circles, and so on. And there are ways to cross-check these testimonies, and nowadays where technology is so available, we use a lot, and other groups use a lot of sophisticated technology to also cross-check some of this information. So I would like to kind of put it as a backbone here, and also to mention that because of that documentation, there is certain agency of different actors, civil society actors in particular, are a key to carry this issue forward. There might be governments that are let's say, favorable to the issue. There may be a UN at some point that is involved as well. However, the civil society efforts are a key here all the time, and they cannot, the civil society cannot take a backseat. It has to drive these processes to the conclusion. And I would like to say that all of the processes that usually involve this documentation, archiving, building memorials, some form of museums, lobbying for special laws, like in South Korea, laws on abductions and so on, filing cases to courts, etc. They have all been done here by civil society since mid-1990s until present. In parallel, we have also joined with other groups. GREC is one of the such groups that joined the transnational network together to actually keep North Korea accountable to the obligations that they actually voluntarily accessed through when accessing to the UN and when ratifying the core human rights treaties. So even though all of this has been done, and even though the Commission of Inquiry has been established, and the Commission of Inquiry gave a great impetus to some of the activities of civil society, simply because certain expertise is nowadays available to civil society, which was not available before the COI and before the value-laden judgment of the Commission of Inquiry. And this is, we do have access to this expertise, but what I find problematic is that still, as it was when I came here in 2004, in this hostile kind of environment of South Korea and also in Geneva, believe me, there was a very hostile environment, especially among South Korean diplomats at the time, that these activities are still taking place on the margins of South Korean society, even post-COI. It is not recognized as an important issue, and it is not, the victims are not recognized as part of the history, very difficult history of this nation, Korean nation. It has to take place, and somebody has to step up to kind of support these efforts. And this is the role of the government to do that. So what I want to actually highlight today is that what the recommendations that COI have issued are still very valid. What is necessity is not lack of civil society efforts, is not lack of expertise and experts, including the UN office that we have here, and experts, including the legal community, technological experts that joined these efforts through different NGOs and so on. There's no lack of it. There is a lack of convergence, and that convergence also has to happen with the support of the Republic of Korea. While recognizing all the historical background, as Professor Lee Jung-hoon mentioned, there has to be a recognition of violations and harm committed by Koreans on Koreans, simply speaking. And because it cannot be done right now in North Korea, South Korea has both moral but also legal obligation to actually step up these efforts. And why do I say that? You know very well that issue of accountability has been very high on the COI agenda and in its recommendations. However, both South Korea and Japan are also member states to ICC. And they have both domesticated the law into the domestic laws that actually, sets up the scope of cooperation with the court, including that Korea also has incorporated the crimes such as crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity in that domestic law. So there is not an issue of only moral obligation, it's also a legal duty of the state to prosecute such crimes because it has the legal means and tools. And moreover, when ROK was very active in actually accessing to ICC and supporting ICC, a lot of personnel from justice sector, the legal personnel, judges, prosecutors, lawyers, actually went and gained expertise at the international courts, including ICC and the extraordinary chambers, for example, of Cambodia. They have the expertise. So South Korea is sponsoring accountability issues abroad in countries like in Africa and cannot resolve it domestically. This is not, and please don't mistake that all of these issues are only related to the top level of the regime. No, there are many people who are also from the mid and lower level of perpetrators that will be living here, may be living here, and will be extradited from other countries here. And I think that this is a way of collaboration also with Japan for South Korea to actually look into these issues, because simply these issues cannot be somebody advised, some NGOs, oh, these people can just go and file the case against, let's say, a murder. This is not a case of a murder, single murder. These are crimes against humanity. They have to be investigated and prosecuted differently, and this is a system that has to also be created here in South Korea. And I'm sure both legal community and many civil society actors will be willing to help in order to support that. And another way is also to support greater access to documentation. And shortly here, for example, there has been efforts in the past to document the issues of South Korean abductees during the war, post-war. There has been a report issued, an official South Korean report. However, the victims still do not have access to the documentation that was behind that report, official report. This is not an access to truth by the victims, and this is something that has to be changed, especially that this documentation is also important for other issues. These issues are such issues as, for example, sanctions, which could be used as part of accountability efforts. And what I mean here is not sanctions, general sanctions, but targeted sanctions. Human rights sanctions, the so-called Magnitsky type of sanctions that can be used by international community and by South Korea, by Japan, vis-a-vis the production that is in the supply chain, what Victor Cha was also mentioning before, that in the supply chain, the crimes against humanity linked to the supply chain of North Korea and how North Korea is producing this in the detention centers, in political prison camps, and through other types of violations against the North Korean people. This type of documentation is really necessary, including greater collaboration with Japan. For example, Korean nationals that were forcibly displaced from Japan to North Korea, and the kind of documentation that we had 3 years ago, great problem to access in ICRC, in Japanese Red Cross, for example, that is also required. And this needs to be in support of the UN and also from the government. The issue of sanctions, what I also would like to mention is that I would also envision that South Korea would embark on a separate law, Magnitsky type of law, adopted here in the South Korean parliament. And so would be advisable that such issue or such law is adopted in Japan. What links to what I mentioned previously is also this public recognition of victimhood of North Koreans and South Korean victims of North Korean regime. I think it has never taken place by even the South Korean government. The public acknowledgement of suffering and all kinds of processes that are involved in that, including educational processes, is very important. And just to give you an anecdote, this summer, and one of the students I've seen here, a very active one, we organized this training for college and university students of South Korea on abductees issues. They were remarkable how they linked with the old generation of victims of abductions and their families. And the victims were so emotionally touched by the young generation. But what they said was, for them, it was the first time for this young generation to even know that there is a South Korean abduction issue here, because nothing like that is in historical textbooks and nothing like that has been raised in schools. So just to kind of give you an idea. And finally, also many lawyers and many organizations and victims tried to also use the courts initially for the civil litigations, and especially it was done with prisoners of war who are kept in a slavery system. My report, the blood coal export from North Korea, who was a kind of key report that also contributed to human rights sanctions by EU, is actually detailing this enormous slavery system that on which the production of North Korea is based, and suffering of second and third generation of prisoners of war, abductees, persons abducted or replaced from Japan, and so on. These victims, even though the courts enforce the positive judgments, they are unable to receive even modest compensation because it is challenged by other courts. And I think what needs to be done is a separate victims fund, international victims fund. And it is also would be linked to sanctions wherever the individuals and institutions in North Korea are involved in grave human rights violations that amount to crimes against humanity, are actually sponsoring through the production, through the supply chain, and they have assets abroad, including the countries that enable this kind of operation of North Korean regime. This type of assets, what has happened during the Ukrainian war and Russia attack on Ukraine and its violation, it has to also happen elsewhere, because these assets are still stored in foreign countries, including in European countries. And that part of assets has to form the international funds for victims, with the modest kind of, compensations. I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the very, very extensive explanations and kind of compelling remark. I appreciate it. In particular, I'm glad you touched upon the COI report, what we have to do as a follow-up, and also documentation and archiving are very important issue you kept highlighting. I think we have to keep in mind as well. And also, I'm glad you mentioned about abductee issues and those family members or children of
Prisoners of
the
war.
prisoners, POWs and others. I will just give us some question later on. And let me just move on to Dr. Kim Bum-soo first, who is one of the another important South Korean NGO, Save NK, representative of the Save NK, and he's going to mainly talk about information inflow and the role of the NGO.
Yes, today I have been asked to talk about roles of NGOs to infiltrate information to North Korea. I'll try to make it brief, but before I start, I would like to mention a name who had put a cornerstone, really a foundation for the North Korean human rights movement, because today is the 10th Remembrance Day. 10 years ago, he passed away, December 2012. His name is Dr. Kim Sang-chul. He founded CNKR, Commission to Help North Korean Refugees. He had collected 11.8 million signatures from 1999 to 2002 and delivered that to UN and to other international organizations. And that contributed to the passage of US North Korea Human Rights Acts, and as well as UN North Korea Human Rights Resolution. He had rescued about 1,500 North Korean refugees, brought them to South Korea. Actually, his wife is here, Kim Min-jung. He's a vice chair of our organization, Save North Korea, which I'm leading. He happened to be my wife as well. So we met actually in 1999 on a street to collect petition for the ask UN to grant refugee status for the North Korean people. So, well, back to the point about the information inflow to North Korea. Well, I prepared that in Korean, so I'll make it brief. 우리 북한 인권 운동은 저는
When it comes to North Korean human rights movement, I think there are two stages. The first is something that cannot be highlighted enough, and that is to raise the awareness of the international community about the severity of the issue. That is advocacy efforts, and this can be involved in diverse areas such as research, diplomacy, and so on and so forth. And the second stage is to encourage changes within DPRK. And to make this happen, we have to make sure that our information can reach inside of the North Korea. To mainstream North Korean human rights issues, the first efforts began in the mid-1990s. And to bring about changes in North Korea, the effort to provide information began in the mid-2000s. But as was noted by diverse panelists, the first stage efforts about enhancing the severity of the issue is still lagging behind. We have been doing this for about 25 years, but we still have a long way to go. For example, last year we conducted an awareness survey. Respondents who answered that North Korean human rights issues are very severe was only about 8.9%. 47.5% of the respondents said that they are nonchalant toward North Korean human rights issues, and 10% said that they are not entirely interested. they're not interested at all. So basically, that means we have a long way to go. If you look at the legal entities registered under the Ministry of Unification, the number is 36. Of course, if we include some of the entities registered under other departments or other divisions, the number will go up. But this low number of entity means that we still have a long way to go, because we have to know the severity to put enough pressure to the government to work, to put government in action. And only that way we can be provided with due support. So the basic challenge for us is how we can enhance the awareness of the international community about the severity of this issue. Then, as for the second stage effort, which is about providing information, this began in the mid-2000s. In Korea, we have a lot of organizations which are doing these activities. For example, we have Free North Korea Radio and the Unification Media Group and the North Korea Reform Radio that are trying to put information into North Korea. As for Save North Korea, we have been the only civil organization which are utilizing the medium wave to provide radio broadcasting to North Korea starting from the 2017. This information is being sent by KBS Hanminjuk Broadcasting or the Far East Broadcasting Company. These are two entities. As for the shortwave, Russia and the third countries are providing shortwave broadcasting to North Korea. And also the military sector and the government is providing broadcasting to North Korea utilizing Voice of Hope or the Voice of People channel. As for the information provision status into North Korea, I want to cite a recent survey as was put by Professor Shin. Actually, this March, the Stanford University published a book titled The North Korean Conundrum: Balancing Human Rights and Nuclear Security. And there had been a survey as to the recent Korean NGOs' efforts toward North Korean residents, and let me summarize it. First of all, the biggest source of external information was radio, according to this survey. 43.5% of them got information from radio, and 30.4% got information from leaflet, and another 30% got information from TV. And as for the motivation for leaving North Korea, many of them were influenced by families or acquaintances, but somewhat big majority of the defectors got influenced by radio broadcast or the drama and movies that motivated them to leave North Korea. And if you look at the media devices owned by North Korean residents, 92% of them owned TVs and 80% of them owned DVD players. And as for the tablet PC, 54% of them owned devices. And as for laptop, 48%, and radio, 34%. About the question that asks if they have an experience of listening to foreign countries' radio, 24% of them said yes. I don't believe that this information that I provided to the organizers are distributed to the participants, but if I am to share some of the takeaways from this survey, what we can learn is the radio is still a meaningful source of information toward North Korea. And recently, so many media devices are owned by North Korean residents, so we can utilize USB sticks or satellites to provide information to North Korea, inside North Korea. Then let me just be brief and end my remark here. And if I get another chance, I will come back and talk more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Director Kim. As I mentioned before, along with the right to food, the right to know is very important, and you detailed that part. You detailed that part, and you talked about the fatigue and other urgency. And there is much less attention to the north, and even in Korea, awareness survey has been garnering less attention, which is very surprising. Then when it comes to improving awareness, I believe you have done so many things so far. So for improving awareness, what can we do?
In the inauguration speech or the UN General Assembly speech, freedom, human rights, and solidarity were highlighted by President Yoon on numerous occasions. Sometimes when we talk about freedom and human rights, it is oftentimes misled and understood as something that is done by like anti-communist parties in Korea or far conservative parties in Korea. But we have to raise awareness that this is not something limited to the conservative parties, and we have to reach the entire public across generation to do more. The North Korean Human Rights Foundation have not yet launched, but if we can launch this foundation, I believe that we have to make sure that all the public can know more about this North Korean human rights issue. Thank you. The foundation is not yet established, and this is still a very big problem, as was pointed by former Ambassador Lee. I forgot to mention this issue in the first session. Thank you for reminding me.
Greg Scarlett, who is Secretary General of North Korean Human Rights, and who's been working so hard and for so long on behalf of the Korean community. I also would like to give you a thank you for your effort and commitment and passions, and hopefully that you can talk about, based on your experience, give us some more advice and suggestions what we could do more.
Master Shin-wha, thank you very much for the kind words, for the invitation to join this august group. And also I'd like to thank the Minister of Unification for organizing this conference. Many words of wisdom have been uttered today. Ambassador Hoon and Professor Victor Cha mentioned a very important endeavor. How do we get Hollywood on board? How do we get celebrities on board? Well, remember that not too long ago, just a couple of months ago, before their temporary dissolution, BTS met with President Joe Biden at the White House. Was there one word uttered about North Korean human rights? None. BTS is not a K-pop band. BTS is a global cultural phenomenon. 140 million people. What a great opportunity. Where are the K-pop artists? Parasite was the first foreign movie to win the Oscars. They had the world's largest stage. Was there one word uttered about North Korean human rights or the suffering people of North Korea? Not one. These are the type of challenges we are dealing with, and this is where civil society must come in and push as hard as we can. And of course, we understand that there are other important issues, political, security, military issues. We understand that there is a certain bias within the national security and diplomatic environment against this particular issue of human rights, perceived as a nuisance. As Joanna was mentioning, we're on the fringes. We're on a fringe issue, practically. So, perhaps many of us understand this. In order to understand North Korea, one has to look at North Korea through the lens of a realist theorist of international relations, if you will, even an offensive realist. From that viewpoint, I suffer from professional bipolar disorder. That's how I look at North Korea as well, but I spend my time as a Wilsonian liberal, trying to affect change through the improvement of the human rights situation in North Korea. So these are all difficult issues that we have to address. And of course, the world is going up in flames, and we have to compete against other very important human rights crises. This is not to discount the importance of attending the other human rights crises. The North Korean human rights crisis, in particular the North Korean refugee crisis, these are slow motion crises. There's somehow the impression that this is not as serious as the other terrible things happening in the world. And this is where the role of NGOs, CSOs, Civil society organizations is very important. Yesterday, I hope I can say this, Mujin, I was having a very interesting conversation with Director Han Mujin and colleagues from MOU about the three tribes. Ours is the human rights tribe. There is a humanitarian and engagement tribe, and there's an unconditional peace tribe as well. Is it possible to bring the three together for a common cause, which is ultimately human rights, democracy, peace, prosperity, reconciliation, eventually unification for all Koreans? And I think that our distinguished keynote speaker this morning, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, has provided us with two answers to how these three, let's say, tribes, groups, can be brought together. One of them is what he said this morning: peace without human rights is meaningless. We have seen attempts at peace declarations, peace resolutions. Of course, we're all in favor of peace. And there can be no peace without human rights. And that's where the role of civil society is very important. We must remind everyone that there is no such thing as peace devoid of human rights. While he was Secretary General, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon was very keen on the concept of human rights up front. Well, as James knows very well, we, the DC crowd, have been using this term quite liberally. I'm guilty of that as well, as in promoting an approach to national security and other issues that also factors in human rights and places it up front. In the case of the UN, of course, what this originally meant was that humanitarian interventions must be cognizant of the human rights situation. Of course, it's very difficult even within the UN. I don't mean to trespass my territory here, but there is a little bit of tension between the humanitarian and the human rights arm of the UN. So this is not difficult, but perhaps moving forward, this is one of our missions. And not because I represent a human rights organization, but I would argue that progress is no longer possible without factoring in human rights. We have been using the same methods to address North Korea for more than 30 years now, whether that involved the 1994 Geneva Agreed Framework, whether that involved the six-party talks, the Leap Day Agreement, the summit meetings. In a different shape and form, the same errors are committed again and again, while human rights is sacrificed on the altar of security, military, and political issues, which are, of course, very important. And where did that get us? I hear this all the time. Oh, human rights in North Korea, that must be a short conversation. Well, no, I can get cute about it, but how about the nukes and missiles? How is that going? While not factoring in human rights. The North Koreans have reached the point where they have the capacity to launch 25 missiles during one single day. Perhaps it's time for a different approach that also factors in human rights. Of course, the world is divided between those responsible UN member states, including the United States and our great allies in the Republic of Korea, that have a keen interest in preserving and improving the international system as we know it. We have nothing better in place. And of course, there are revisionist powers that try to challenge us. And of course, us, NGOs, civil society organizations, also feel the pressure of that divide. My organization was fortunate to acquire UN ECOSOC consultative status. My good friend Nampada and our colleagues at PS Core also have that consultative status and know how difficult it is to obtain it. Why do real pro-democracy and pro-human rights organizations have such a hard time getting in? The answer is simple: because revisionist powers, or not exactly beacons of human rights or democracy, hold the key to access to the UN system through the NGO committee. So the only way to do it is to get shot down in the NGO committee and then overturn it at ECOSOC. But again, that takes a lot of member country support, of course, had the support of not only the United States, but also Canada and the European Union. So NGOs are also feeling this pressure, and North Korean human rights NGOs are also feeling this pressure. Very important issues have been mentioned today, and CSO can have a very important part in implementation of these issues. Of course, at the United Nations, for a few years now, the North Korean human rights issue at the Security Council has been discussed as AOB, any other business. As Joanna was saying, crimes against humanity do not qualify as any other business. They're much graver than just that. And of course, following the UN COI report in 2014, 15, 16, and 17, the issue was placed on the agenda of the UN Security Council. It's a procedural matter. It takes 9 out of 15 votes of permanent and non-permanent members. And I can assure you, and my colleagues in the audience and on the podium know, that CSOs play a very important role in liaising with UN member states, with UN agencies. Documentation is very important, and also providing this type of information is extremely important. In the US, I don't even need to say it again, we do need special envoy for North Korean human rights to play the extraordinary role that Ambassador Robert King played until February 2017. He was more than just a special envoy. We in the NGO community know that he was our best friend and our cheerleader. And it was very important to have that cheerleader in that position because of the difficulties we face on the job. And of course, here in South Korea, there is the eternal drama of the North Korean Human Rights Foundation. This issue has been politicized for way too long. I think that our South Korean friends, allies, and partners need to get beyond this. And it will be for the benefit of not only NGOs based here in South Korea with an agenda to address North Korean human rights, but I think that it will be very beneficial to all NGOs. Fundamentally, what we need is a paradigm shift that continues to address all of these important issues that threaten the lives of millions in Northeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, and beyond. And as we address these issues, it is also very important to include human rights in this new paradigm. And this, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, is our greatest challenge moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg Scarlett. Well, your very compelling statement, there's no such a thing is devoid of human rights. I think we should remember that. And also what you highlighting for paradigm shift should be coincide with what Dr. Kim Bum-soo was mentioning about a new and creative approach to address the North Korean human rights issue. Well, we have 20 to 25 minutes left. So I would like to raise one questions to each and then just open the floor so that the panelists can have an opportunity to respond to. Probably to Greg and Joanna, as you know, we really need to have a UN Security Council hold an open meeting on North Korean human rights issue, right? For that, I counted, and in 2023, one vote will be needed to add to the 8 states in the council already. That is US, UK, France, Switzerland, Malta, Albania, Japan, Ecuador. I think they already just signed the US letter. But to achieve the one needed things to make it 9, one of the following states will need to be persuaded to join the 8 on that issue. 3 of them are Africans. So Brazil, Gabon, Ghana, Mozambique, and UAE. So for that, probably, Joanna, you talk about our cooperation with Japan over the abductee issues, and I just came back from Tokyo, and I fully agree with it. But in addition to that, what we should do for those African countries, we just reach out for them to persuade in short run, but this open meetings. And in the mid and longer term, we need their support, because not only the solidarity of like-minded countries to address our issue, but we have to persuade and engage with unlike-minded countries are very important. So I would like to, based on your experience working on this issue for a long while, if you can give some idea, it would be great. And for the President Kim and me, you touched upon very important issue, health issue. Those health issue in the event of the unification, that will be the problem for both North and South Koreas. But in the meantime, what we can do to address or improve the health issue of the North Korean ordinary people, particularly vulnerable groups, in terms of the human right issue, in terms of addressing the human right issue of the North Korea. And for the James Heenan, you briefly mentioned about a report will come soon. So can you just elaborate a little bit more about that? And also, can I just ask you, I just met with Elizabeth Salmon last week in Tokyo, and she said that she's together with you to preparing for kind of the international meeting on the human right issue of the North Korean women, right? So can you tell us why that is important at this moment, and what is your plan at the end of January?
Mm-hmm.
And for the Dr. Kim Bum-soo, I fully agree with you about those importance of the information in the inflow. But probably you heard about role of the think tank, but also role of the do tank. That's what they are talking to try to send the information into it. So how we can combine to inflow the information into North Korea, and at the same time to get hard evidence or more accurate information out of the North Korea, so that we can having more campaigns or some kind of the tools to raise awareness about North Korean human rights issue. In that connection, probably Greg, you can talk about your hard effort on satellite image to learn about the North Korea. Having said that, let me just open the floor for the questions you address to the specific panelists. And hopefully just your comment and question is as precise and as brief as enough, so that we can give a more opportunity to others who are here in person and also participating in online. Yes.
I'm Ihan-gil from Korean Peninsula Forum. I'd like to ask a question to Executive Director Bum-soo Kim. So to improve awareness of the severity of North Korean human rights issues, this is my interest, and I believe education would be a great tool to do that. And I have researched on my own, and I found that the problems are quite severe than expected, more severe than expected. And according to statistics, about 72% said they have been educated regarding human rights, and they said main educators is education facilities. But according to a survey of Education of Unification, the word of human rights has never been appeared in the context of education of human rights. So I believe the role of the public education would be very important going forward. And to improve the awareness of the severity, I believe government need to be more committed. So I'd like to know whether public education can give some courses regarding North Korean human rights issues. And whether it is not possible, then whether we need to think about whether we should, NGO or CSIS should take that role.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Guillermo Kirkpatrick. I am the ambassador of Spain. Thank you very much to the Ministry of Unification for organizing this seminar, and thank you, Ambassador Shin-wha, for moderating these two very interesting panels for me as an ambassador who has just arrived in Korea. When from abroad we look at the issue of North Korea as it is considered, as it is dealt with within South Korea, sometimes it's surprising to see that this is not a matter of national consensus. Some foreigners, as foreigners, we might tend to think that such an important issue, which is related to the existence itself of Korea, of the Republic of Korea, of a unified Korea, should be a matter which should not be politicized in the way that it is. No? Some way it is very surprising to see that the gap in the political parties in the National Assembly about how to deal with North Korean issues, human rights, disarmament, non-proliferation, denuclearization, is so wide. So my question would be, to what extent is this a reflection of a divide in the society itself? Do citizens in South Korea really are divided in between hardliners and softliners? Is there a fatigue in the society in South Korea to the point that citizens of today, of the 21st century, the year 2022, they tend to ignore and be bothered and be worried by maybe other issues? Now, to what extent this is a reflection of the society? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can ask President Kim and Dr. Kim is answering questions. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for Deputy Director Yohana Hosanya. And first, I want to say thank you for your dedication. As I think a part of the hostile environment for North Korean human rights NGOs is a severe indifference, especially among young people like teenagers and college students. So you already told that you hold some education programs with students. I agree we are on the right track, but I think we need a new and brave strategy to make the people interested and motivated on this issue. So my question is there any plan or strategy you are working on for this goal? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Can I just give an opportunity to young students who are attending here? Yes? And I will close the questions after you.
Hi, my name is Jung Park from Young Leader Forum of Korean Peninsula. About the BTS, I've been thinking, actually, we considered about how to change the North Korean human rights issue to a general issue in South Korea. Actually, BTS, RM has mentioned about US and Korea alliance while he was in US, which caused Chinese government to protest BTS. So I thought this soft power may change South Korea's perspective of North Korean human rights. So half joke, half dream, we talked about DMZ peace concert of Coldplay and BTS. Since Coldplay has positive image in Korea, which was showed on their last concert, they talked about Sewol Ferry, but it didn't cause any political issues. So I thought, like Coldplay, who cares about humanity and has positive image in South Korea, could cause something different, especially for young generations. So if there is an opportunity for BTS or Coldplay or other DMZ peace concerts, from history, I've written the column about Bohemian Rhapsody and North Korean refugees, the related history of refugee life. This caused many other colleagues to look at North Korean human rights issue from the different perspective. So if all of us can make an opportunity to make a different approach to this North Korean issue to South Koreans, I think it could cause many difference in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe President Kim, you can start with.
Thank you. This fall, we had the Unification Forum. It's a very important dialogue that we have at the university on unification. for the first time, we did a survey of young students trying to understand what their yearning of unification is. And according to the survey, the students said that in their generation, the generation of the 20s and the young 30s, for them, unification was not a must. In my generation, and in our generation, in Professor Lee's generation, and Ambassador Lee's generation, unification is a must. We have a song, Unification. Our 소망, 우리의 소원은 통일. So it's like, you know, our dream is unification, and you know, there's no question about that. But in the younger people, it's not a dream. It's something that needs to be taught and convinced. So they said it's important for us to be convinced that unification should be our dream. So they said, why don't you think about making unification, not trying to convince us and, you know, shove it down our throat. That's what they said. The unification should be our dream, but why don't you work with us to think about why unification should be a must? Maybe try to work with us to find what is good or bad, good and bad about unification, but maybe think first about peace. Peace in the peninsula before unification. So it may be a play of words, but think about a peaceful peninsula before unification without thinking about peace. So I want you to think about that for a minute and think about a peaceful peninsula with or without unification, and think of different ways in which we get toward peace. And if you think about peace, there are many different trajectories toward unification, and some may bring us to unification quickly, but others may require a much longer time span and a different way to get there. And there are many different examples around the world if we take peace first. And Germany had a very different road toward peace before unification. There's a very, very famous saying that they were trying not to unify before going to peace. So talking to young people and asking them what they think about the peaceful existence on the peninsula before making unification an end goal, I thought was a very important understanding and sort of an enlightening moment for me. And so that's one thing. Does this reflect a fatigue about the unification topic? Maybe it's a generational gap. And I think overcoming the generation gap, because the people we're talking about, reflects the generational gap, perhaps, reflects the political divide, reflects how people have been politicizing this issue. So maybe we need to start from scratch again, trying to think what this really means to people and how we go about peace before we think about unification. I think that's where we should start. Maybe this comes from someone who's for someone whose expertise does not lie in this field. There was a specific question addressed to me by Ambassador Shin-wha. In terms of the health issues, what we need to do in the meantime in order to improve the health issues for North Korea from the human rights perspective. I think there are three things that we need to do. First, in the international community, even with the sanctions against North Korea, we're allowed to provide international humanitarian assistance to North Korea, especially regard to medical, public health issues, and so on. We're not able to do that. Of course, if North Korea says, no, we don't want humanitarian assistance, we're not able to do that. but we need to think about how we can provide humanitarian assistance. If it is the South Korean government, if it is some of the other development partners, donors who are not willing to do that, we need to remove that bottleneck also, because there are some governments that are not willing to provide that support to North Korea, and we need to work on that. Second, as I was looking at working with the students, with young people in my university and other universities, there are many North Korean defectors in South Korea, and they are very keen on studying public health, medicine, and other fields that they think would be helpful for North Korea. I think we need to support them. And these are fields that are not very easy for them to study. They're in medicine, public health. I hope we can provide more support for them. They need also to be engaged in the international network so they can work in international NGOs and international organizations. And they have not been well equipped in language and international networking and so on. And we need to provide that support so they can be more helpful. And that's what they want to do. I want them also to have better connections and working and networking opportunities in other Southeast Asian countries, and for various reasons, and they're more affinity with those countries and so on. And finally, I work in international development cooperation. So whatever the South Korean government does for North Korea, it doesn't count for our official development assistance. But we work in the international community, we work at international organizations, we work with the international norms and regulations and within the international framework for development cooperation. So in the event, in the future, when North Korea is able to receive international development cooperation, international foreign aid, they will and would have to work within those broad international framework. So even if Korea's aid doesn't count for ODA, they will have to abide by those international guidelines and so on. So those people who are working in international development cooperation field in South Korea and with us in trilateral and multilateral aid should work with North Korea experts. We don't work together in Korea. We need to work together. We share our expertise, share our networks. The Ministry of Unification, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I don't think work together that well. This is the first time that the ambassador to North Korean human rights has worked with Ministry of Unification, which is, I think, fabulous. This needs to happen more often. There has to be more cooperation within the government, with civil society, between these different communities to share their expertise and know-how and networks.
Thank you very much. And James Heenan.
Sure. So, yeah, next month we'll have a report on enforced disappearance. It covers all forms of enforced disappearance which are linked to North Korea. So, you know, enforced disappearances during the war and after the war from the Republic of Korea, abductees from Japan and so forth. So it covers all forms of involuntary enforced disappearance. It includes a significant legal analysis, including analysis of the crime of enforced disappearance, a crime against humanity, which is where it is seen to be systematic. It includes a lot of quotes from the families. Enforced disappearance is one of those peculiar human rights violations and crimes where it's ongoing because it actually affects other people, and until people know what happened to their loved ones, it continues to be an ongoing violation. I won't tell you what the conclusions are because I want you all to take the report when it comes out. Okay. The Special Rapporteur has decided to focus on women and girls in her first year. It's her decision, it's her mandate. She's independent from us. We're working with her to bring together a conference in January. Why women and girls? I mean, it's of interest to the rapporteur, but it's also something that North Korea does engage with CEDAW, the CEDAW committee. There is an interest there on women and girls. That's one issue. The second thing is that we have a lot of information on women and girls. Everyone here will know that the majority of escapees in recent years are women and girls. So there's a very solid information basis to hold this event, and I understand that more events will be held in other places, and the rapporteur will submit a significant report on the issue of the rights of women and girls in North Korea. I would also say, just on the point about using celebrity status, celebrity firepower to draw attention to issues, okay, it's worked very well, but there are also significant risks with it, because celebrities can be fairly, they can be a celebrity one day and not the next. Here, but I have to say that in other places, it has allowed for a debate to start. Now, in some places, it's become extremely tense and difficult. For example, in Palestine, where you have, on behalf of many in the artistic industry, a boycott of Israel. That's one extreme. But I think here what we're talking about is just using the platform to get a message across. And I think in such a stuck situation as we are now, I think that absolutely has to be explored as much as possible, because we talk here, and this has been my experience until I met people from the North, it's sort of we lump North Koreans together, they're the North Koreans, and until you humanize it somehow, it's very difficult to get the traction and the empathy that you need to work on human rights. So that's one thing we're trying to do, particularly with youth, to try to get them, I don't know, many of the organizations here already do it, to bring them together so people can see what that they're humans like you and me. Thank you.
Good, thank you. And to the other panelists, since you spent a little longer time before, I can only give you 1 to 2 minutes, so bear with me. So Greg first.
Thank you very much. So on the Security Council question, strategically, paradigm shift. We need to push for that. Tactically, we need to persuade our own government, in our case, the United States, that the issue must be placed on the agenda of the Security Council again. Others can do the same thing, working with the like-minded permanent members of the Security Council and other like-minded members. A phone call must come from the permanent representative, for example, of the United States mission to the permanent representative of the mission we're trying to persuade. They'll send their demarche to their capital, then he'll come back. As civil society, the best we can do is press and, of course, try to soften up opposition by providing information, satellite imagery, and all kinds of documents that we have acquired over the years. Speaking of satellite imagery, Ambassador Shin-wha, yes, this has been a very powerful tool in our arsenal and our methodology. We were the first human rights organization to use satellite imagery to shed a light on North Korea's vast system of unlawful imprisonment. This was Hidden Gulag by David Hawk, published in 2003. We have continued with the same methodology, establishing a baseline, updating these reports. Very important under COVID, where access to sources inside the country has been severely limited. Satellite imagery is very important. Satellite imagery alone cannot tell the full story. One needs the human side as well. I won't call it human intelligence because we're a human rights organization. And finally, on BTS, Park Chung-ju 대표님, you're absolutely right. A DMZ concert devoid of any mention of human rights is not a peace concert, it is surrender. Human rights must be part of this. Let's do it together. Remember, it's not BTS, it's not the boys and girls of K-pop. It's those humongous corporations that manage each and every second of their lives. We need to write, we need to publish, we need to get together. 같이 갑시다. Let's go together.
Thank you very much. And 김범수.
예, 우리 아까 이대사님께서 질문해 주신
About the question that Ambassador Lee has mentioned, how can we bring information out of North Korea? About that, we actually share similar roots. Previously, when we broadcasted our radio broadcasting into North Korea, we sometimes put in the CCTV and brought back the footage of like execution taking place in North Korea. And also you pointed out the problem related to the human rights education. I believe that this is linked to what Spanish ambassador just asked. Depending on what administration comes in, I think we are approaching differently to North Korean human rights issues, which is very regrettable. And we have talked about the fatigue issues within our society, and I believe that we need a completely different approach toward North Korean human rights issue. The future human rights and the development of North Korea, which is linked with future. I think that is the right framework for us to take when we look at North Korean human rights issues. And sometimes we have been divided among the civil society actors within Korean society as well. And I think we need to create a cooperation between all these different stakeholders. When it comes to the education facility for North Korean human rights, be it Unification Education Agency or the local authority, I believe that there are discussions that is going on about the need to enhance education centering around these organizations, which is positive thing. So I dream of this scene. If we can see 1 million candle lit before the City Hall of Seoul for the human rights issues, for the societal issues in South Korea, I think this will lead to diverse solutions. And also, when it comes to North Korean broadcasting toward North Korea, we're not actually aided by the South Korean government. Sometimes we were hindered depending on which administration came in, and we're actually supported by US side. So why does it take place? We have North Korean regime several hundred kilometers above us, and if I am Kim Jong-un, if I'm to think what I will do in the Korean society, try to think about this. Try to be in the Kim Jong-un's place and try to think what he will do if he was in South Korea. And if we think in that way, we can identify diverse root causes behind in the South Korean society, which is hindering us from finding diverse solutions. Thank you.
Be the last hammer, right? Thank you. I think there is no lack of civil society effort in terms of work with the UN Security Council. But the approach of certain countries has to be done in a more, let's say, intelligent manner, something that we have done in the past with the resolution since 2003, 2004 especially, to convince certain countries to support the UN resolution on North Korean human rights. And this is where I see the discussion is lacking. The connection between human rights violations, the crimes against humanity, the security issues on the peninsula, and humanitarian situation in North Korea. Many people know that, yes, this is connected, but how? Well, there is a lot of evidence how it is collected. And women and children, and the reason why the country is so impoverished and women and children do not have access to health and to basic necessities is the fact that they not only have to support themselves, but since the 60s, the regime is operating the quota system and they have to provide children, women, people in detentions, quotas of goods that are being turned into the export and are supporting the military development of Korea. These women and children also outside of detentions are used for forced labor, including on farms that produce narcotics. This is transnational organized crime, and that is supporting the military development. This is why you saw the Korea Party Congress and military using the new uniforms ask any children from North Korea or women how they produce this kind of quotas to support the fur for the military in order to produce this. This is where this links comes in, and this is where all the production and how in the North Korean supply chain and international trade and so on really plays a role, and how it affects the security on the peninsula and so on. Finally, just final remark to what was mentioned, I don't think there is, I also thought that there is a great disinterest among the youngest generation of South Koreans in North Korean issues. I don't think this anymore after the summer program. There is a lot of interest simply because many South Korean students go abroad, study abroad, and they are exposed to international way of living, democracy, human rights, how other people mobilize. They just don't buy the message here in South Korea. They just feel it is very artificial, that they cannot unify with a country that violates the basic abuses of other Korean people. They just don't feel emotionally connected to such message. And I think there is a lot of work being done by a small group of people. This small group of people also established a resolution on North Korean human rights, lobbied for COI, lobbied for UN office. The group was not bigger than these two tables combined together. So you, as a young generation, you have to, in a small group, lobby the celebrities in South Korea, abroad, organized through SNS websites with young generation abroad. You can carry, and the small group can carry this message forward. And I'm sure there are enough of people who may not be active, but will support your efforts. It's just, it's really brave to kind of make this step forward. And if you need a help, please come to us, to Greg, and to others. We will also support you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, the Yoon government, when it comes to North Korean human rights issue, the accountability should be given the priority, but at the same time, we have to also have having a constructive, creative approach or engagement with North Korea as well. I think that is include the humanitarian assistance as well. But when we say humanitarian assistance, I don't mean we are reverted to the previous government who are only focusing on humanitarian assistance and reunion of family in consideration of the special inter-Korean relationship. But I mean by humanitarian assistance here is as a critical and important tool to improve the human rights and livelihood of the North Korea ordinary people. So having said that, I think we have a very diverse and also sometimes a conflicting idea and approach over North Korean human rights issue. But hopefully, as we having this kind of big and small and online, offline meetings over the years, hopefully we can create the rooms of the common ground, bigger rooms of the common ground to discuss the North Korean human rights issues, so that our end state is finally the freedom for the North Korean people themselves. So having said that, thank you so much to joining us for this important event. And hopefully we can meet again and continue this kind of discussion in the months to come. Thank you so much, and I will declare the end of the session.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador Lee Shin-wha and panelists, for such an insightful discussion today. Personally, this session is especially helpful and it resonates with me as a person who works in this community as well. And Your Excellencies and distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, everyone who is with us here today, we had a very incredible gathering and discussion, and the reflection and discussion that we had today will lead to revitalizing and enhancing awareness of this issue upfront again. With that, let us conclude the 2022 International Dialogue on North Korea Human Rights. Thank you very much.